This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. Unexplained tension crept into my life the moment my neighbor unearthed that stone tunnel. Before that discovery, I had felt confident and relaxed in my newly built house on the rural outskirts. The area was calm. I could see open fields from my windows, and I heard only distant farm animals or the occasional passing vehicle. My days were simple. I'd wake up with the sun, walk around my property, and enjoy the quiet. Even at night, the darkness and stillness felt comforting. Then my neighbor, who lived a short walk down the road, decided to do some digging in his backyard. He wanted to install a new fence and possibly create a vegetable patch. One afternoon, he came by excitedly and told me he had found something unbelievable while moving dirt. A hole had opened up beneath his shovel. When he cleared some more earth, he saw what looked like an old stone arch leading underground. He claimed it formed part of a small tunnel, though he couldn't see its full extent. I felt curious, but also cautious. The house I lived in was new, and I had assumed the land was free of hidden structures. It seemed the area had secrets no one had mentioned. We walked to his backyard, and I peered down into the half-exposed tunnel. The stones forming the walls looked worn. There was a musty smell rising from within, but no immediate rush of air. It felt oddly cold near the entrance. My neighbor shone a flashlight inside, and I could see the passage continue for a short distance before darkness swallowed the rest. Neither of us wanted to climb down. We just stood there, both of us uneasy. He said he would call someone to check its stability, maybe a local historian or an archaeologist. I nodded, feeling my stomach tighten. Over the next few days, nothing seemed different at first. I returned to my routine, figuring the tunnel was just a strange relic that wouldn't affect me. Then small things started to happen in my house. One morning, I woke up and found 2 framed pictures from my wall lying on the floor. I examined the frames, expecting broken glass or bent hooks, but the frames were intact. The nails in the wall still looked firm. It didn't appear as if they had fallen naturally. It was more like someone had lifted them off the wall and set them down. I picked them up, checked them again, and rehung them, feeling my heartbeat thump a little harder than usual. That same night, I stepped out into my yard for some fresh air. It was quiet, and the stars were bright. I went back inside and closed the sliding door halfway, leaving it slightly ajar to let in a breeze. Half an hour later, I noticed the door was open wider, at a strange angle. I hadn't touched it since I came back in. The night air felt chilly, and the gap was bigger than before. I froze, scanning the living room. Nothing else seemed out of place, but the hair on my arms stood on end. The next morning I tried to convince myself these were coincidences, faulty nails, maybe a gust of wind. But the sense of being watched grew stronger. A few nights later, I woke up to a faint noise in the hallway. It sounded like the creak of a floorboard, but it was soft and brief. My heart pounded. I got out of bed, grabbed my phone for light, and opened my bedroom door. The hallway was empty. I padded through the house, checking each room, feeling my neck tense up. Everything looked normal, the furniture, the curtains, the locked doors. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I stood still, trying to hear anything else. The silence pressed in on me until I gave up and went back to bed. Eventually, I started noticing how my nights felt heavier. I would lie in bed with my eyes open, imagining footsteps in the next room. During the day, I'd find doors left ajar or objects moved, but there were no signs of forced entry. Sometimes I smelled something faint and musty, similar to damp earth, but I could never locate the source. My neighbor visited one afternoon and told me a local authority had inspected the tunnel and found it potentially unsafe. They weren't sure of its origin, but it appeared old. He was thinking about filling it in or sealing it for safety reasons. I kept quiet about what was happening in my home. I didn't want to sound paranoid. The disturbances became more frequent. One late night, I got up to grab some water and found my kitchen lit only by moonlight. I saw every drawer pulled out an inch or two, all at roughly the same distance. It was a bizarre sight. I stood there, feeling a chill run through my arms and back. My lips went dry. I closed the drawers carefully, not making a sound. My breathing felt shallow and shaky. I avoided the urge to call my neighbor at that hour because I doubted he could do anything. It wasn't like someone had broken a window. It felt more like an unseen person had simply explored my kitchen while I slept. I tried to stay calm by reminding myself that I hadn't been harmed. No vandalism, no real damage, just strange rearrangements. But that hardly comforted me when I imagined something invisible rummaging through my house. Each evening the tension grew. I found myself double-checking every cabinet, every door, and every window before bed. I left no drawers open, no items near the edges of counters. Still, something always felt slightly off by morning. A door I had closed would be cracked open, or a light that I was sure I turned off would be on. None of it was life-threatening, but it was enough to make my nerves raw. Meanwhile, my neighbor told me he planned to seal the tunnel soon. He said the structure seemed to extend under part of my property, but no one knew exactly how far. That possibility made me anxious. Could something have traveled from that tunnel into the soil beneath my home? That thought sounded ridiculous, but I had no better explanation for the sudden changes in my house. I slept fitfully, imagining noises in the walls or faint scuffling under the floors, though I never found real evidence of that. One dawn, I woke up earlier than usual and walked through the living room. A picture frame on my shelf was turned sideways, and the small rug near the door was folded up at one corner. It looked almost like someone had quietly examined things in the night and left in a hurry. My chest felt tight. I half expected to find muddy footprints, but the floor was clean. I wanted to call someone, to tell them that something was happening, but I knew how it would sound. There was no proof, only my uneasy observations. I pressed my hands against my temples, trying to stay composed. Days later, my neighbor went ahead with sealing the tunnel. He hired a few workers to fill it with gravel and concrete. I heard the machinery early one morning. He apologized for the noise, but I waved it off, hoping that after they plugged the entrance, things might calm down. That night, I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. As I locked up before bed, I realized the house seemed quieter than usual. The floors didn't squeak, and I noticed no odd smells. I slept better than I had in weeks, though I remained on edge, waiting to see if the pattern of strange activity would resume. To my surprise, the next several days were peaceful. My items stayed where I left them. My doors remained in the correct position. I didn't hear any odd sounds in the night. It was as though someone had simply left. At first, I kept expecting something else to happen. Each morning, I'd cautiously inspect my walls and furniture, checking for any sign of tampering. But there was none. The relief felt overwhelming. I realized how stressed I had been by the constant wariness. Now, for the first time in a while, I felt comfortable sitting in my own living room at night. Despite the return to normalcy, I couldn't forget the sense of being watched. Even in the calm that followed, I remembered every creak and subtle movement that had haunted my house. I sometimes wondered if whatever had come from that tunnel had simply gone dormant. I told myself it was over, that sealing the tunnel had solved the issue. But part of me stayed alert. I felt certain that something had studied me and my possessions for days, maybe weeks. The experience left a distinct mark on how I viewed my home. It was no longer just a new house in the countryside. It was a place where something unexplainable had walked my halls. I talked to my neighbor in passing. He mentioned how the workers had poured a lot of concrete into the entrance, blocking any entry point. I said I was glad the matter was resolved. He asked if anything strange had happened in my home, and I hesitated. I told him a brief version, that I noticed odd movements of items and that the house felt unsettled. He gave me a cautious look. I could tell he was uncomfortable with the topic, but he nodded, saying that the land was old and might hold more secrets than we realized. In time, life went back to its usual routine. I resumed my morning walks around the fields, enjoying the fresh air. I kept busy with my work. Each evening, I locked up and turned out the lights, no longer dreading what I might find the next morning. Occasionally, I got a small flash of that old anxiety if I thought I saw something flicker in the corner of my vision. But nothing ever came of it. It felt like a memory trying to latch onto my mind, reminding me of those uneasy nights. Even so, I never fully shook the feeling that someone or something had once passed through my home, opening drawers and shifting objects with curious, gentle motions. It was a subtle presence, not violent, yet deeply unnerving. I still can't put it into words without sounding unsure. There was no dramatic final event, no confrontation. The phenomena just stopped as soon as the tunnel was closed. Now, whenever I sit on my porch at sunset, I sometimes recall the hush of those nights when I heard faint creaks and found drawers pulled open by unseen hands. That memory still makes my chest tighten. I sometimes picture an unseen visitor lurking around in the dark, observing me, stepping softly on the floor. It's not terror exactly, but it's a reminder that quiet, rural land can hide forgotten histories. A single hole in the ground can stir up disturbances in unexpected ways. I still live here, though, and most days I feel perfectly safe. The old tension is gone, replaced by a cautious respect for what I don't understand. I remain grateful that whatever shadow passed through my halls left once the tunnel was sealed. Whether it returned to wherever it came from or just disappeared, I can't say. I only know the difference in the atmosphere is real. My home is peaceful again, but I have a permanent memory of those few weeks when it felt like I wasn't alone. That experience taught me that something small, like uncovering a hidden passage, can invite things we aren't prepared for. And sometimes all it takes is sealing an opening to end the disturbance, but not the memory. Unsettling news reached me in the middle of a dull afternoon. A neighbor caught me by the mailbox to share a strange story. He claimed he had seen a fleeting shadow in the building's corridor, shaped like a person, but gone the instant he tried to focus on it. I remember laughing lightly, telling him he must have been tired or mistaken. Yet I felt a small jolt in my chest as I walked away. I often prided myself on my rational outlook, but the nervous look in his eyes lingered in my mind. That same evening, I returned home late. The hallway's lights were on, but one fixture flickered, creating a dim stretch between the elevator and my apartment door. As I walked along, a wave of tension drifted over me. My scalp tingled, and I felt a faint chill against my neck. It reminded me of my neighbor's story. I half expected to see a figure in the corner, but the corridor looked empty. I hurried to my door, unlocked it, and slipped inside with my heart beating faster than normal. Once I was in my living room, I set down my bag, removed my shoes, and tried to shake off the weird feeling. I turned on some music, hoping the familiar tunes would steady my nerves. But my mind kept wandering back to that corridor, the flickering light, and the subtle weight in the air. I wondered if I had let my neighbor's words influence me. Before, I would have shrugged off the notion of a ghostly presence. Yet something about the hallway that night bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Over the next few days, the building's atmosphere changed in small but noticeable ways. The corridor lights started acting up at random times, not just flickering, but sometimes dimming momentarily as I passed. The superintendent claimed it was an electrical issue, but I never saw anyone come to fix it. At home, I noticed a few odd occurrences. One morning, I found my key ring on the kitchen counter instead of the side table near the door, where I was certain I had left it. I thought maybe I had carried it absent-mindedly to the kitchen after returning from errands. But as the days went on, more of these trivial details piled up. I tried ignoring it all. My job was stressful, and I had enough on my mind. I convinced myself that I was just misplacing items. But the sense of being on alert never really left me. Each time I entered the corridor, I took a deeper breath, feeling my pulse rise. The hallway was average in size, painted a bland beige, with a few paintings hung at intervals. Nothing about it should have made me uneasy. Yet every time I stepped out of the elevator, I felt tension settle over my shoulders. I occasionally ran into other tenants on the stairs or near the mailboxes. Most people didn't mention anything unusual. A couple of them looked tired or preoccupied, but never brought up the corridor. One time I tried joking about the flickering lights to a guy who lived 2 doors down from me. He only responded with a vague shrug, saying he had heard about some odd stuff. Then he changed the subject. I felt frustrated, like I was stuck with a puzzle no one wanted to solve. Little things began to add up. One night, as I came home from a late shift, I saw a small table in the building's entryway moved a few inches from its usual spot. It didn't seem like something the maintenance crew would do. The table usually held a vase of fake flowers, but that vase was gone. My skin prickled and my stomach tightened. I listened for footsteps or voices, but all I heard was the distant hum of the elevator machinery. I hurried upstairs, feeling unsettled. The next morning, the table was back in its usual place, complete with the vase. Nobody explained why it had been moved. At home, I tried to maintain a normal routine. I cooked dinner, watched a bit of television, and tried not to dwell on the hallway. But sometimes, I would catch myself glancing at the door, half expecting to sense movement on the other side. My rational mind kept telling me there was no actual threat. The corridor was just a corridor, and maybe the flickering lights were the building's wiring acting up. Yet the tension in my body didn't go away. One evening, I saw my neighbor, the same one who had first told me about the shadow, returning from the laundry room in the basement. I asked him if he'd seen anything else weird. He hesitated, then told me he sometimes heard faint knocks or soft rustling sounds when he walked past the building's storage area at night. He looked spooked as he mentioned it, so I nodded sympathetically. I didn't want to push him for details, but my nerves tightened. I realized I wasn't alone in my unease. In the following days, more oddities emerged. The overhead lights in the corridor dimmed or flickered whenever I was out there, though I noticed they seemed normal when others walked by. I occasionally heard a muffled sound, like a soft shuffle behind me. But when I glanced over my shoulder, I never saw anything. One time I froze in front of my apartment door, certain I felt eyes on my back. My scalp tingled, and my breathing went shallow. I spun around, but the corridor remained empty, the walls blank. I rushed inside, slammed the door, and locked it with trembling hands. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was just my imagination building on my neighbor's initial story. Yet the repeated incidents wore on me. I slept poorly, often waking up in the night feeling tense. At work, I found myself drifting into daydreams about that hallway, wondering what could cause those subtle shifts in atmosphere. I considered the possibility of some electrical phenomenon, or maybe a small animal scurrying in the walls. But none of that accounted for the sense of an unseen presence. I didn't believe in ghosts, but my nerves told me something was not right. One weekend, I decided to stay out late with friends, thinking if I avoided the building's corridor at night, I might feel better. But I had to come home eventually. It was past midnight when I arrived. The lobby was silent except for the faint buzz of the overhead fluorescence. When I rode the elevator up, I tried to calm my breathing. The doors slid open, and I stepped into the hallway. The lights were half lit, creating pockets of shadow. I walked slowly, hearing my own footsteps echo. Halfway down the corridor, I felt a sudden pulse of cold air against my face. It was strong enough to lift the hairs on my arms. I froze, my fingers tightened around the keys. Then the cold sensation vanished, and the air felt normal again. I rushed to my apartment door, fumbling with the key, eventually forcing myself inside. My heart pounded. I locked the door and pressed my back against it, panting. Over the next week, I tried to gather my courage. I kept telling myself there was a logical explanation. Still, I dreaded stepping into that hallway alone at night. Every time I pressed the elevator button on the ground floor, I braced myself for whatever I might feel on my floor. The building's management put a small notice by the mailboxes, stating they would be upgrading some electrical components soon. I felt a small surge of hope that maybe new wiring would solve the flickering lights and end the tension. But before they could start, more unsettling events occurred. One time, I left a key on my kitchen table, only to find it later on the coffee table in the living room. I stood there, staring at it, going over my own actions to see if I had absent-mindedly moved it. I couldn't recall doing so. Another evening, I heard a soft thump in the corridor outside my apartment. I peeked through the peephole but saw no one. My hand shook as I placed it on the doorknob. Finally, I decided not to open the door. I walked away, feeling my pulse hammering in my ears. In spite of these fears, there was never any direct threat. No one got hurt, and nothing was damaged or stolen. I ended up describing it as a quiet visitor, something that lingered just beyond sight. This sense of subtle intrusion wore me down. I started returning home earlier, or timing my arrivals so that I could catch another resident in the corridor, just to avoid being alone there. Sometimes that worked. Other times, I had no choice but to face the hallway by myself. Eventually, I grew tired of tiptoeing around. One night, I decided to stand in the corridor for a few minutes, silent and still, just to test my nerves. I waited until around 11 p.m., when fewer people were around. Then I walked out, left my door slightly ajar, and remained in the hallway. My heart thudded with every breath. The lights were steady, but the air felt thick. I strained to hear any movement. I might have stood there for 4 or 5 minutes, scanning the corridor, expecting a flicker of motion. I heard nothing. I saw no shapes. Yet my instincts screamed that I was not alone. My eyes watered from the strain of staring. Finally, I retreated into my apartment, locking the door. I felt convinced there was some presence, even if it refused to show itself. From that point on, I accepted the situation as part of living in this building. Maybe it was some hidden phenomenon, or just a trick of the mind triggered by the flickering lights and the rumor my neighbor had shared. Either way, the unease never fully left. I went about my daily life, greeting neighbors, climbing the stairs when the elevator was crowded, taking out the trash, while carrying an underlying awareness that the corridor had a life of its own. The tension was quiet, not violent. It was enough to keep me on edge, but not enough to push me into leaving. Eventually, the electrical work began. They replaced some fixtures, changed bulbs, and inspected wiring in the walls. After that, the flickering lessened. The corridor felt a bit brighter. I noticed fewer odd events with my keys and personal items. For a while, I allowed myself to believe it was over. Yet a small part of me stayed alert. There were still moments when I sensed that faint chill on my neck or glimpsed a shadow shift at the end of the hallway. It might have been my imagination feeding on old fears. But I knew that once something like this gets inside your head, it's hard to shake off. The building carried that subtle hush, as if an invisible tenant roamed its halls. I kept living there, feeling mostly at peace once more. But I never fully forgot those nights of tension. The creeping sensation that something stood right behind me, the flickers in the corridor, or the chill that brushed my arms without explanation. Now, I take each evening more slowly, careful to notice whether the hallway lights remain steady or the air shifts. I can't say I believe in ghosts or supernatural forces, but I do believe in the power of a place to hold traces of something we can't see. And after what I've experienced in that corridor, I know I'm not the only one who wonders if some parts of our world remain hidden and silent, waiting to give us that sharp jolt of uncertainty. Foreseen tension hit me on my second day in that foreign house. I had arrived there for a short stay, hoping to learn about local customs and enjoy a quieter life for a while. The building had a unique design, a central courtyard open to the sky, surrounded by tall walls and narrow walkways. When I first entered, I admired the white walls and old wooden furniture placed around the edges of the courtyard. Everything looked calm, and the hosts were polite. There was a cook, a cleaner, and one other employee who served as a caretaker. They all greeted me warmly. During the daytime, the place felt quiet and welcoming. I could hear the distant city noises beyond the walls, but inside, the atmosphere was serene. Tall windows opened onto the courtyard, letting light spill into the corridors. At first, I felt at ease. I ate my meals with the hosts, exchanged simple conversation, and explored the local streets when I had free time. My room was small but comfortable, with a bed, a narrow desk, and a single window looking out onto the courtyard. The stone floor stayed cool, and the high ceiling gave the room a spacious feel. On the third afternoon, I was sitting in the courtyard with one of the employees, a quiet man who mostly kept to himself. As we talked, I felt an abrupt drop in the air temperature. It was a warm day, so the sudden chill made my arms prickle. Then I noticed a quick movement at the far corner of the courtyard, just a dark shape flickering across my line of sight. I glanced in that direction, but I caught only the tail end of something that vanished behind a pillar. My pulse sped up. I asked the caretaker if he had seen it, and he nodded slightly, his eyes flicking downward. Then he got up and excused himself. I watched him walk away without another word, leaving me alone with a growing sense of unease. That evening, I mentioned what I saw to my hosts. They waved it off, suggesting maybe the afternoon light and the arrangement of shadows had played tricks on me. They told me not to worry, that the house was very safe. Their calm demeanor should have reassured me, but my stomach stayed tense. Something about the caretaker's reaction bothered me. He had shown no surprise, only a resigned expression, as though he knew exactly what I was referring to. Over the next few days, the atmosphere shifted whenever night approached. The courtyard, bright and pleasant in the daytime, took on a heavier mood at dusk. The lights were kept low, and the corridors leading away from the courtyard seemed darker than they should have. My room felt comfortable enough when I closed the door, but each time I stepped back into the hallway, I sensed a sudden thickness in the air. I had no logical explanation for this feeling. My rational side said everything looked normal. White walls, dim lamps, and wooden benches here and there. Yet I struggled to relax. One late afternoon I was chatting with the cook near the kitchen. The kitchen door opened to a back passage that also connected to the courtyard. While we spoke, I noticed the door swung slightly on its hinges, as if a breeze had pushed it. The cook frowned because there was no draft in the kitchen. We both looked at the door, waiting to see if someone would appear. Nothing happened. Then the cook shrugged and said it was probably the wind, but I caught a glimpse of worry in her eyes. That night, I lay awake in my room, reading by a small lamp. The rest of the house was quiet. Around midnight, I turned off the lamp and tried to sleep. A short while later, I heard a faint noise in the courtyard. It sounded like soft footsteps, but they were too light to be sure. My heart rate picked up. I considered peeking through my window, but I felt a wave of reluctance, as if I feared I might see something I couldn't explain. Instead, I stayed still, listening. The footsteps, or whatever they were, continued for a few seconds, then stopped abruptly. My body remained tense for several minutes. Eventually, I dozed off, but my rest was uneasy. The next day, the caretaker approached me in the courtyard, his voice low. He said in broken English that sometimes people see things in this house. His gaze was direct yet uncomfortable, and I asked him what he meant. He shrugged, looked around to ensure no one was listening, and said the courtyard could be crossed by shadows at certain times. He had witnessed them himself. They never spoke or caused physical harm, but they unsettled those who noticed them. Then he walked off, leaving me with a knotted feeling in my chest. I realized that the staff might know more about these strange occurrences than they let on, yet none of them wanted to speak openly. From that point on, I felt an increased awareness of my surroundings. I paid attention to each shift in lighting, every gentle breeze, every sound that echoed in the open space. One afternoon, while moving through the house, I passed one of the corridor windows, looking onto the courtyard, and saw a brief flicker of movement near a group of potted plants. It was the same fast, dark blur I had seen before. I rushed to the window and looked out. Nothing was there. I scanned the courtyard, focusing on the columns and the corners, but the space was empty. My heart thumped so hard that I felt a slight buzz in my temples. At dinner that night, the hosts were cheerful, asking about my day and making plans to show me local sights. I had trouble responding normally, too preoccupied with the incident I had just experienced. I wanted to ask them directly about these shapes, but the caretaker's warning glance earlier made me hesitate. I sensed that they either didn't believe in such events or they preferred not to discuss them. So I bit my tongue, ate quietly, and excused myself as soon as it was polite to leave the table. Later, I stepped into the courtyard alone. The sky above was a deep blue, lit by faint stars, while lanterns cast weak light around the perimeter. The center of the courtyard felt dim. I stood there, trying to gauge if I would notice anything unusual. My pulse quickened, and I breathed carefully, my chest tight. After a minute or so, I caught a slight drift of cooler air against my left arm. The courtyard had no wind that night, so the sudden chill made me uneasy. I glanced around, seeing only the same pillars, walls, and furniture. Yet my instincts told me something was present. My hair stood on end. I felt compelled to back away, as though I sensed an unseen figure moving in the gloom. I retreated to my room, closing the door behind me with shaky hands. In the following days, the pattern repeated. Some afternoons felt completely normal, with bright sun and lively conversation. But each evening, as the sun lowered, I felt a shift. It was subtle, yet unmistakable, like a damp blanket settling over the house. On a couple of occasions, I spotted an unexplained movement near the corners of the courtyard. It was always fast and close to the ground, as if someone crouched or crawled along. Each sighting lasted only a second. My chest would lurch and my muscles would tense. Then it would be gone. I also noticed that some rooms carried a deep silence, more pronounced than normal. In those spaces, I hardly heard the usual household sounds, no muffled voices from other rooms, no clatter of dishes, just a flat hush. Standing in those rooms made me uneasy. My ears strained to pick up any noise, and sometimes I thought I detected a faint whisper or a soft brushing sound against the walls. Whenever I asked the employees about it, they shrugged politely or changed the subject. Nights became the hardest. Once in a while I was awakened by the creak of floorboards, though the floors were mostly tiled. Another time, I heard what sounded like cloth dragging along stone, but it stopped after a second. My adrenaline spiked each time, leaving me sweating under the sheets. I would sit up, listening carefully, my breath shallow. I never caught a clear glimpse of anything in those moments, but the feeling of being watched overwhelmed me. I found myself dreading bedtime, staying up later than I should. When I finally lay down, I left the lamp on, hoping it might keep the shapes at bay. On my final day, I decided I needed answers. I waited until I found the caretaker alone. I pressed him gently, asking if there was some history to this house. He hesitated, then admitted there had been tales of previous inhabitants who had vanished. Some said their presences lingered. He didn't confirm any details, nor did he deny them. He just repeated that whatever walked in the courtyard meant no harm. It was better, he said, to leave it alone, not to challenge it. I felt chills spread across my body as he spoke. Then he apologized and excused himself again. That afternoon, I went to my room to pack. As I gathered my belongings, I sensed a heavy presence outside my doorway. My skin prickled. For a moment, I stood completely still, clenching my fists. I half expected the knob to rattle or the door to open, but all I heard was the loud pounding of my own heart. After a tense minute, the feeling passed. I exhaled shakily and resumed packing. When the time came to leave, I walked out to the main hall. My hosts shook my hand, thanked me for visiting, and wished me safe travels. I forced a polite smile, but I couldn't hide my relief. The caretaker avoided my gaze, standing back with a solemn expression. I stepped into a waiting car outside, and as it pulled away, I looked back at the house. The courtyard walls rose high, concealing whatever lingered within. I felt a weight lift from my chest as we drove off. In the days after, I could still feel the residual tension. When I recalled the courtyard at night, my muscles tensed, and I remembered the rush of cold air along my arm. I had not suffered any physical harm, but the psychological strain was real. It left me with a vivid sense that not all houses reveal their true nature to casual visitors. Some places remain guarded, containing pockets of activity that resist explanation. Although I never fully saw the shapes that moved in that courtyard, I still recall the racing pulse and the deep certainty that I was not alone. And that memory remains the strongest impression from my stay in that foreign home. Unexpected dread seized me the moment I stepped into that nearly empty building after midnight. I had agreed to work extra hours, thinking the silence would help me focus on sorting through a pile of documents that needed urgent attention. The building itself was large, with multiple floors and wide corridors that felt cavernous at night. The regular daytime bustle was gone, and the only illumination came from the emergency lights placed along the halls. Everything seemed still, except for the faint hum of ventilation. I thought the peace would be a relief, but I felt my nerves tightening as soon as I reached the upper floor. I had a key to the offices on that level. The hallway stretched out on both sides, dimly lit by the small lights set at intervals. My footsteps created a dull echo against the tile floor. I walked to the room where the documents were stored, unlocked it, and switched on the overhead fluorescent lamp. The sudden brightness flooded the room, providing a small sense of security. I told myself I would finish my task quickly, maybe in a couple of hours, and then head home. Inside that office, I organized file boxes, threw out old papers, and sorted new ones. The silence, at first, felt manageable. I heard only my own breathing and the rustle of documents as I flipped through them. After about half an hour, though, I caught a faint noise outside. It sounded like a soft metallic tinkle, as if something metal tapped against a wall or a rail. I lifted my head, listening. The sound stopped. I held my breath for a moment, then let it go, figuring it was a random settling noise in the building. Sometimes old events or pipes cause strange sounds, especially at night. I returned to my work, but my concentration had slipped. My ears stayed alert. A short while later, I heard the noise again. This time, it was slightly louder, and I recognized it as a dull, rhythmic clank that repeated a few times. It was not fast, and there was a slight pause between each clank, like someone tapping metal gently against a hard surface. My pulse quickened, and I felt a knot in my stomach. I looked at my phone, noticed the time was around 1 in the morning, and tried to decide if I should investigate or ignore it. I switched off the overhead lamp and stepped out into the hallway, hoping the dimmer lighting would help me see if anything was moving around. The corridor looked empty. The emergency lights cast pale circles on the floor, leaving long stretches of shadow in between. I moved a few steps toward the far end, trying to listen. My heart thumped heavily. The building's ventilation system hissed softly, but I did not hear the metallic tapping. I stood still, straining my ears, but everything was quiet. After a minute, I decided to resume work. I returned to the office, clicked the fluorescent lamp back on, and tried to focus on the files. 10 minutes passed in silence. Then the clanking noise started again. It was more distinct now, echoing in the corridor. My hands went clammy, and I noticed my breathing had grown shallow. I realized I couldn't block it out. I needed to check. I grabbed a flashlight from a desk drawer, it was there for emergency drills, and switched off the office light again. The hallway's glow felt colder than before. With the flashlight in hand, I moved in the direction of the noise, which seemed to come from around a corner near the stairwell. My footsteps felt too loud, and I tried to walk lightly. The clanking repeated a couple more times, then stopped as I reached the corner. I shone the flashlight around, illuminating the walls, the floor, and the stairwell door. Nothing was there. The corridor was empty. No loose metal pieces on the floor, no obvious source of the sound. The door to the stairwell was closed and locked from the inside. My pulse pounded in my ears. I felt my stomach twist. I wondered if someone else might be in the building, but the front doors were locked at night, and the security guard downstairs would have announced any visitors. Still, I considered going back down to ask if anyone else had come inside, but the idea of walking all the way to the elevator, riding it to the lobby, and leaving the documents unfinished felt complicated. Also, I was reluctant to seem jumpy in front of the guard. I decided I would finish my work fast and leave as soon as possible. I returned to the office, turned the light on, and tried to push through my remaining tasks. My heart still thumped, and every small noise made me flinch. I thought I heard faint footsteps in the corridor once or twice, but each time I paused to listen, the building fell silent. My concentration was shattered. I stacked papers, labeled boxes, and did the bare minimum to make progress. Eventually, I felt close to finishing. My phone showed that it was almost 2:30 in the morning. The building felt colder, and my shoulders ached from tension. I decided to power through the last few documents. That's when I heard a different sound, a soft sliding noise, like a door or a piece of furniture being shifted. It came from somewhere down the hall. My eyes darted to the open office door. I fought the urge to slam it shut. Instead, I stood frozen, listening. My breath was shallow. When the sound stopped, I realized my hands were trembling slightly. I forced myself to continue. If I allowed my fear to take over, I would never finish. I placed a final set of files in a storage box, sealed it, and tidied the desk. My mouth felt dry, and I noticed a slight headache creeping in. I told myself it was just the stale air combined with stress. Once everything was in decent order, I switched off the fluorescent light, stepped into the hallway, and locked the office behind me. The corridor felt even darker now. The emergency lights cast thin beams, and everything else lay in shadows. My heart pounded as I walked toward the elevator. Each step echoed in the silence. Halfway there, I heard a faint clank again, coming from behind me. It made me whip around. I shone my flashlight, but saw only the empty corridor stretching back to the corner. The sound didn't repeat. My throat felt tight. I turned back toward the elevator and practically jogged the remaining steps. At the elevator door, I pressed the button repeatedly. The wait felt too long, each second stretching out. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the corridor. My flashlight's beam shook slightly in my hand. I thought I saw a flicker of movement near the far end, but it might have been a trick of the emergency lights. When the elevator finally arrived with a soft ding, I jumped in and hit the button for the lobby, my breath catching in my chest. The ride down felt agonizingly slow. The fluorescent light inside the elevator flickered once, and I felt a jolt of panic. My reflection in the mirrored wall looked pale and tense. I steadied myself, trying to breathe normally. After what felt like an eternity, the elevator reached the lobby, and the doors slid open. The security guard behind the desk glanced up, looking half asleep. I walked over and tried to sound casual, though my voice probably shook a bit. I asked if he had seen anyone else enter the building. He said no, and the security log was empty. I told him I thought I heard some noises upstairs. He shrugged, suggesting maybe it was just the old pipes. I hesitated, then nodded, feeling silly. But I couldn't shake off the creeping sense that something was off. I stepped outside into the cool night air and felt relief wash over me. My shoulders relaxed for the first time in hours. The street was mostly deserted, with a few distant headlights passing by. I got into my car, locked the doors, and let out a shaky breath. My mouth was still dry, and my hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel. I took a moment to collect myself before driving away. The next day I tried to rationalize everything. I considered the possibility of old building noises, random mechanical clangs, and my own imagination running wild in a quiet setting. But the memory of that rhythmic metal tapping and the sense of being watched didn't fade easily. I decided I wouldn't volunteer for nighttime work there again. The extra pay wasn't worth the anxiety. My supervisor asked if I could finish a smaller batch of tasks during the next week, and I quietly insisted on daytime hours. I didn't give a detailed explanation, just said that working nights had been inconvenient. He didn't push the issue, so I avoided a second experience. I never told my coworkers the full story, worried they might think I was overreacting. But each time I passed that building's upper floor during regular business hours, I remembered those eerie moments, my heart pounding in the silent hallway, the faint metallic clanks, and the feeling that something hovered just out of sight. To this day, I can't fully explain what happened. I only know that being alone in that large, dark space at such a late hour brought out an unease I couldn't shake. Even now, if I picture the emergency-lit corridors and recall the sound of metal tapping in the distance, I feel my shoulders tense up and my stomach clench. Perhaps it was nothing but the building's infrastructure, or perhaps I caught a glimpse of something no one else has admitted encountering. Either way, I avoid that place after sundown. I learned the hard way that certain buildings hold a different presence at night, and not all quiet spaces are as empty as they seem. Nerving stillness pressed in on me as I stepped into the backyard that night. It was late, a bit past midnight, and the neighborhood was nearly silent. I had no particular reason for going outside, except that I wanted a moment to myself. The house felt a bit stuffy, and I needed fresh air. The sky was dark but clear, with just a faint glow near the horizon from distant streetlights. I noticed there was no wind, not even the slightest breeze. The trees stood motionless, and the air felt too calm. At first, I stood near the back door, crossing my arms against the mild chill. My yard was modest, just a patch of grass with a few shrubs and a small fence. Beyond the fence lay more yards from neighboring homes, but none had their lights on. Everything looked dead still. Even the crickets seemed to have gone quiet. Usually, I'd hear them chirping, but that night it felt like the world had paused. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing in the night air. My shoulders relaxed slightly. After a hectic day, the silent darkness offered a small relief. Then a subtle noise reached my ears, something like a faint, low murmur. My eyes snapped open and I scanned the yard. I didn't see anything. I held my breath, trying to listen more carefully. A few seconds later, the murmur faded. At first, I wondered if my mind was playing tricks, or if I was just hearing my own blood rushing. But then I heard it again. It sounded like a whisper, but I couldn't pick out any words or direction. It was so quiet, more like a soft rustling than an actual voice. A cold tingle ran through my body. I took a step off the small concrete slab near the door and stood in the middle of the grass, craning my neck to detect a source. The sound floated in the air, never fixed in one spot. My mouth felt dry and my heart pounded. I couldn't see a neighbor's lights or movement of any kind. I tried to reason that maybe it was a stray cat or some distant conversation carried on the wind. But there was no wind, not even the gentlest gust. The yard still felt unnaturally calm. I decided to walk a slow circle around the grass, paying attention to each step. My shoes made a soft crunch on the ground. The murmur came and went in brief intervals. Sometimes I heard it almost behind me, sometimes off to my left. Yet every time I turned in that direction, I saw nothing. My nerves started to fray. I felt my shoulders tense and the hair on my arms stood up. The night was too silent for random chatter. I considered that maybe someone was in a nearby yard, talking under their breath, but that explanation didn't fully ease my anxiety. After a few minutes of scanning the darkness, I forced myself to retreat inside. I locked the door, flicked on the kitchen light, and stood there breathing heavily. My heart pounded, and my forehead was damp with sweat. I stared at the backyard through the glass, expecting to see a shape or some sign of movement. The yard remained dark and still. I went to bed, but sleep refused to come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that whispery sound in my memory. I ended up tossing and turning until dawn. The next day I tried to brush off the experience. I convinced myself it must have been a neighbor outside or some trick of acoustics in the night. But as evening approached, I found myself dreading the idea of stepping outside. I stayed indoors, watched some TV, and tried to occupy my mind. Around midnight, curiosity and a lingering sense of unease pushed me to open the back door again. The air was cool. At first, I heard nothing unusual. Then, as I stood there, the faint murmur started again, as if it had been waiting. My stomach clenched. This time I tried to focus on the sound itself. I wanted to determine if it had a pattern or if it sounded like actual speech. I leaned forward, squinting in the darkness, trying to sharpen my hearing. The murmur rose slightly, then dropped, almost like a conversation in another room. I couldn't make out words, but the intonation felt too structured to be random noise. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped back, hand reaching for the doorknob, ready to dash inside. Still, I stood there a moment longer, trying to push through my fear. The skin on my face prickled, and my heart pounded so loud that it nearly drowned out the quiet sound. Finally, I had enough. I retreated, locked the door, and pulled the curtains. I felt like a coward, but I couldn't handle the unknown stirring in that dark yard. I ended up pacing my living room, rubbing my arms for warmth even though the temperature was fine. Over the next few nights, I followed a pattern. I would gather enough courage to step into the backyard, stand there for a short time, and wait to see if the murmur returned. Each time, it did. Sometimes it took a few minutes to start. Other times it began almost immediately. There was never a clear source, and I never saw a silhouette or movement near the fence. I checked the front yard once or twice, thinking maybe the sound was coming around the side of the house, but the front yard was silent. The tension built inside me. During the day, I found myself distracted at work, replaying the nighttime scenes in my mind. I asked a friend casually if they had ever heard strange noises at night in their yard. They laughed it off, saying sometimes stray animals or plumbing issues can create odd sounds. I didn't want to push the subject, fearing they'd think I was paranoid. But I knew the difference between a typical night sound, like a cat meowing or a pipe rattling, and these persistent, whispery murmurs. One weekend, I tried a small experiment. I set my phone to record audio and left it on a table in the backyard while I stood at the back door. I waited until I heard the faint whisper start, then I let it record for a few minutes. Later, I played the recording inside. I heard background silence with only a mild hiss of static. The murmur was barely audible, and it sounded more like a faint breeze than a voice. Yet I knew there had been no wind. My frustration grew. I had no solid evidence and no explanation. All I had was a heightened sense of dread that my yard was hiding something intangible. I tried different strategies, turning on the patio light, scanning the fence line with a flashlight, even calling out, "Hello, is anyone there?" in a firm tone. None of it changed anything. The murmur would come and go. Sometimes it sounded closer, sometimes more distant. Each time, my adrenaline spiked. My palms would sweat, and I had to fight the urge to run back inside like a frightened child. As the weeks passed, my anxiety around midnight deepened. My routine changed. I would double-check the locks on all my doors. I started keeping the curtains drawn after dark because I hated seeing the backyard. On a few occasions, I dreamed about stepping outside to find a shape crouched in the corner, whispering. In those dreams, I'd wake up with my heart pounding and my sheets twisted around me. Eventually, I decided to talk to one of my neighbors who had lived in the area longer. I casually asked if they ever noticed unusual sounds at night. They just shook their head, saying the area was typically quiet. I didn't press further. I realized I was on my own. Either no one else noticed, or it only happened in my yard. That thought made me uneasy. One night, near the end of summer, I worked up the nerve to stay out longer than usual. I wanted to face this thing head-on. I stepped into the yard around midnight, wearing a sweatshirt and holding my phone flashlight in my hand, though I kept it off for now. I stood still, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The faint glow from the distance made shapes just visible in my yard. I stayed near the center of the grass, waiting. Minutes passed with nothing. I felt a slight sense of relief, thinking maybe the murmurs wouldn't come this time. Then the sound began. It was softer at first, a gentle hiss. Gradually, it gained a rhythmic quality, more like a real whisper. I gripped my phone tighter, resisting the urge to switch on the flashlight. My chest felt tight, and my breathing turned shallow. I listened carefully, trying to pick up any pattern. The noise drifted in the still air, sometimes behind me, sometimes to the side. I spun around, scanning the fence. I saw no one. My eyes darted to every corner, every shadow. The murmur lingered, almost as if it circled me. At that moment, my courage cracked. My hands shook, and I switched on the flashlight, sweeping it around wildly. The beam illuminated empty grass, blank fence boards, and a few shrubs. Nothing else. Yet the whisper persisted for another second or two before fading completely, as if it slipped away the instant I used the light. I stood there, panting. My mouth felt bone dry. The yard fell silent again. I rushed back inside, slamming the door and locking it. My entire body trembled. I realized that no matter how long I stayed out there, I might never see the source of the murmur. It existed just at the edge of my perception, retreating when I tried to confront it. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about how it felt to stand in the yard with that whisper swirling around me. It was more than just a noise. It felt like a presence. In the following days, I scaled back my nighttime backyard visits. I told myself it wasn't worth the stress. I tried to treat the yard as normal during daylight, watering my small plants or letting in sunshine through the back windows. But as soon as night fell, I avoided looking outside. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of the dark yard through a gap in the curtains and feel my heart rate spike. The memory of that whisper haunted me. Eventually, I accepted that this was my new reality. The house was otherwise fine, and I wasn't prepared to move over something that felt intangible. I adapted by ignoring the backyard after dusk. If I needed fresh air, I went out front. I told myself that as long as I wasn't outside listening, it couldn't bother me. The tension remained, but it stayed at a dull background level. Even now, I wonder if it ever stops. Some nights, while I lie awake, I think I hear the faintest murmur through the walls. My rational mind insists I'm imagining it, but deep down, I recall the time I stood in the yard and felt that intangible presence drifting around me. Maybe it's still there, invisible, whispering in the stillness, waiting for someone to step outside and listen. I do my best not to dwell on it, but I haven't found the courage to stand under that silent sky in the middle of the night again. The memory of that whisper is enough to keep me indoors once darkness settles. Unsettling tension gripped me the first evening I settled into the chalet. The place was small and set away from any crowded roads. I had arrived earlier in the afternoon, bringing only a few essentials and some books. The building stood in a quiet clearing, surrounded by low vegetation and a few sparse trees. Everything felt peaceful at first. Inside, I found simple wooden furniture, a couple of soft chairs, and an improvised shelf holding a small collection of old books. The lighting came mostly from a few scattered lamps that gave off a gentle glow. It all seemed welcoming and calm. During my first hours there, I unpacked my things and explored each room. The layout was straightforward: a living area, a compact kitchen, a single bedroom, and a small bathroom. The walls were plain, and the floors were a bit creaky in places, but nothing felt out of the ordinary. By nightfall, I was content. I made myself a simple meal, read for a while, and then decided to sit in a comfortable armchair by the window. Outside, the darkness stretched across the yard, with only a hint of moonlight touching the sparse trees. It was quiet, so quiet that the slightest noise inside the chalet felt amplified. As I sat there, I felt a slight unease that I could not pinpoint. The air smelled neutral, no odd odors, no draft coming in. The temperature was mild. Still, something about the interior arrangement bothered me. I scanned the room. The wooden table was where I had left it. The few books I had brought remained on a small side table, and the lamps cast a dim but steady glow. Nothing seemed out of place, yet I felt a nagging impression that the scene was off in some small way. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the quiet. My arms felt a faint tension, and I noticed my breathing getting shallower. Eventually, I stood up and decided to check each room, mostly to reassure myself that there was no hidden problem. I walked slowly, floorboards creaking under my steps. The bedroom looked fine, bed neatly made, my bag in the corner, closet closed. The kitchen was tidy, with only a plate and a cup in the sink. The bathroom had nothing unusual. Finally, I returned to the living area, feeling silly for expecting something amiss. But as I passed near the window, I caught a glimpse of my own reflection in the glass. Something else appeared there, too. The reflection showed the interior of the chalet behind me, but there was a slight distortion near the armchair I had been sitting in. It looked like a faint shape or outline. My pulse kicked up. I spun around, shining the small lamp's light at the armchair. Nothing was there. The seat was empty, and the space behind it looked normal. Yet, when I looked back at the window, the faint distortion still appeared. It hovered in the reflection near the same spot. It had no clear form, just a blur or ripple. My heart pounded. I reminded myself that windows can create strange reflections, especially at night. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or a smudge on the glass. I leaned closer to inspect the window, but I found no mark. I wiped it with my sleeve. The distortion remained in the same place, faint but present. My hands felt clammy, and I rubbed them on my pants, struggling to keep calm. For a moment, I considered stepping outside to see if the reflection changed. But the idea of wandering around in the dark yard made me uneasy. Instead, I tried shifting the angle of the lamp. That only changed the reflection's brightness. The odd shape lingered. I felt a jolt in my stomach, an instinctive alarm. There was no voice, no footsteps, no tangible threat. Yet my body reacted as if something invisible hovered near me. I forced myself to step back from the window and sit down in the armchair again. My breathing was unsteady, and I tried to distract myself with a book. The words on the page drifted by without sinking in. My mind stayed on that subtle distortion in the glass and the possibility that it could be something more than a simple lighting trick. Every so often, I glanced at the window, careful not to look directly at the reflection, as if avoiding it might help me settle down. The chalet itself felt unchanged, quiet, no strange drafts, no furniture moving on its own, but the tension in the air seemed to build. After perhaps 20 minutes of fruitless reading, I decided to get ready for bed, hoping sleep would reset my thoughts. I switched off the lamps except for a small one near the couch, giving me enough light to move around without stumbling. As I passed the window, I could not stop myself from taking one last look. The reflection was dimmer now, with less light to feed it, but the distortion still seemed to hover near the armchair. A chill ran through my arms, and I hurried to the bedroom, shutting the door behind me. I lay in bed with the blankets pulled up to my chest, my eyes on the faint outline of the door. I felt no desire to open it again. I told myself it was just a reflection quirk. That explanation did little to lower my heart rate, but it kept me from panic. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a fitful sleep. I dreamt of strange shapes in the corners of the chalet, but the details were hazy. When morning came, the sunlight poured into the chalet through the windows, bringing a fresh sense of relief. I walked into the living area and found everything looking ordinary again. The window showed a clear view of the outside, and in the daylight reflection, I could see only my own figure and the bright interior. No distortion, no shapes hovering near the armchair. I felt my shoulders loosen. The tension that had weighed on me the previous night receded, leaving me slightly embarrassed about my reactions. I wondered if I had let my imagination run wild because of the silence and isolation of the place. Still, I could not shake the memory of how real that distortion appeared. I ate a simple breakfast, then stepped outside into the cool morning air. The sun lit up the low vegetation, and I heard a few birds calling in the distance. The chalet looked harmless enough from the outside, a small wooden structure that might have been built for calm getaways. I considered telling someone about the reflection, but I had no idea who. The place's owner had not mentioned anything strange. And what would I say? I saw a weird blur in the window. I doubted anyone would take it seriously, so I said nothing, hoping my next nights there would be less eventful. Throughout that day, I busied myself with small tasks. I took a short walk around the property, read a few pages of a book in the sun, and wrote some notes in a journal about my experiences in the area. Part of me kept glancing at the window when I passed it, but in daylight, everything stayed normal. The tension from the previous night felt distant, almost dreamlike. By the afternoon, I convinced myself I might have overreacted. Night came again, and I prepared for a calmer evening. I turned on a couple of lamps, made some tea, and settled in the armchair near the window, although I angled it slightly away from the glass. At first I relaxed, sipping the tea and diving into a more engaging book. But as time passed, I began to sense that quiet pressure again. The air felt heavier, and my mind started to wander. I told myself to keep my eyes on the pages, but I failed. Curiosity got the better of me. I glanced at the window reflection and saw a faint ripple forming. My heart thudded. It looked so subtle that I might have dismissed it as a trick, but the memory of the previous night made me tense. This time, I stood up quickly and approached the window, determined to see if I could identify the cause. I tried shifting the lamps around more deliberately, adjusting their angles and brightness. The reflection changed in brightness, but the distortion remained. When I moved my own position, the distortion's placement relative to the armchair seemed to stay the same. It hovered in that space on the glass, like a faint smear or shape behind the actual reflection of the interior. My skin tingled and my breathing grew ragged. I couldn't see a silhouette, just a patch of slight blur, yet it gave me the powerful impression of something observing me from behind. In a surge of anxiety, I swung around to check behind the chair. Nothing. The room was empty. My ears picked up no footsteps. The only sound was the quiet hum of a small fan near the kitchen. But I could not rid myself of the sense that something was present, even if I couldn't see it in normal sight. I stayed awake most of that second night, pacing around the chalet, checking every corner, opening and closing the bathroom door, and flicking lights on and off. The tension never resolved. I felt no physical threat, just the unsettling weight of an unseen presence. Around dawn, I finally crashed onto the couch, exhaustion overwhelming my nerves. By the time I woke, it was late morning, and the sunlight again made everything appear harmless. The reflection showed only the bright interior, with no sign of the strange blur. On my last day in the chalet, I struggled with whether I should cut my stay short. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, while another part thought I might be letting paranoia get the best of me. I chose to remain, telling myself it was only one more night. I spent most of the day in the yard or reading outside, returning to the chalet only for meals and short breaks. The place felt normal in sunlight, almost comforting, but I could not forget how it changed after dark. My stomach clenched whenever I thought about the reflection. That night, the same pattern repeated. The interior lights cast warm glows on the wooden walls. The chair stood by the window, and from across the room I could make out the subtle distortion in the glass whenever I moved close enough to see my own reflection. I tried ignoring it, focusing on a book in a different corner, but the sense of being watched settled over me like a heavy blanket. Eventually, my nerves gave out, and I retreated to the bedroom, shutting the door with more force than necessary. I turned on the bedside lamp and stared at the ceiling for hours, too keyed up to sleep. The only relief came with the first rays of daylight. When it was time to leave the chalet, I felt an odd mixture of relief and regret. The mornings there were pleasant, and I liked the natural setting. But the nights had worn me down with a quiet, persistent dread. As I locked the door for the final time, I glanced at the window. In the bright sun, the glass reflected nothing but my own face and the sunlit interior. If someone had told me a story like this, I might have doubted them. I never heard loud noises or saw a clear shape, but I experienced a strong sensation of something invisible, a presence that only revealed itself as a distortion in the reflection. I did not share the details with friends or family. I suspected they would say it was a trick of the light, or maybe a sign of overtiredness. But I know how the atmosphere felt inside that chalet when night fell. I recall the tightness in my chest, the cold prickling on my arms, and the way my mind struggled to explain the subtle changes in the window's reflection. It taught me that not all fear comes from obvious signs. Sometimes a small, persistent hint of the unknown can produce a deeper unease than any loud scare. Even now, I sometimes think back to that armchair, the glass, and the faint distortion hovering behind me. The memory remains vivid, and I doubt I will ever see a simple window reflection without recalling that unsettling stay. Something felt off the moment I first saw the driveway. The sky was clear, and the sun was behind me, but I noticed the long shadow of an old Victorian house up on a hill. I had just arrived by car. The driver was polite but quiet. He set my bags on the gravel, nodded once, and drove away without lingering. I gripped my suitcase handle and stared at the house. The exterior looked well maintained, yet I felt a tightness in my chest when I stepped onto the porch. It was my first day in that place, and I was supposed to stay there for a few weeks, reading old books and organizing some notes. I wanted peace and quiet. I entered through a large wooden door with a brass handle. The inside hallway was dim, even though the windows seemed large enough to let in more light. I flipped a switch, but the overhead lamp flickered before settling on a weak glow. I stood still for a moment, feeling the silence around me. My first goal was to find a suitable room upstairs. I rolled my suitcase across the foyer. The floor squeaked with each step. I heard the echo of my footsteps stretch through the corridors. It felt strange, but I told myself that old houses make noise. It was just the wood shifting under my weight. On my second day, I walked around to get acquainted with each room. I tried to figure out the best spots for reading and writing. The living room had tall windows covered by thick curtains. The wooden floors creaked under my feet. The walls were lined with shelves, some empty and others cluttered with odd trinkets. I noticed that the dust in some spots looked undisturbed, like no one had moved anything for a long time. I opened a few cabinets, but I found nothing of interest. I started feeling uneasy, though I could not identify the cause. It was the kind of feeling that made me glance over my shoulder every few minutes. By the third day, I began to sense something near me. I had not seen anything unusual, but I felt a subtle shift in the air whenever I passed certain corners. I checked the windows to see if there was a draft. I found none. During the late afternoon, I went to the attic for the first time. A narrow staircase led up there, and each step let out a dull groan. The door at the top stuck slightly. Inside, I saw old trunks, boxes, and a few chairs covered in yellowed sheets. Dust motes floated in the weak beam of my flashlight. I set my flashlight on a trunk while I looked for a place to sit. Suddenly, it flickered for a second. In that brief moment, I sensed someone beside me. My muscles tensed and my heart pounded. I spun around. No one was there. I steadied my breathing, telling myself it was just my own nerves. I grabbed my flashlight and hurried back downstairs. Later that evening, I decided to check the basement. I wanted to inspect the boiler to see if there was any reason for the slight chill in some of the rooms. The basement door was near the kitchen, and the light switch worked poorly. It produced a faint yellow glow that barely cut through the darkness below. I stepped slowly, keeping one hand on the banister. The air felt heavier with each step. My ears caught a faint tapping sound, like fingertips against a concrete wall. I stopped and held my breath. I heard it again, very soft, near the far side of the basement. My pulse quickened. I aimed my flashlight at the walls, but I saw nothing. After a few seconds of silence, I forced myself to keep going. I checked the boiler, turned a valve, and went upstairs as quickly as I could without running. My legs trembled a bit, and my breath felt shallow. That moment stuck with me. On the fifth night, I was in bed when I heard a light scraping sound. It came from the hallway, near the top of the stairs. At first, I thought it was a branch outside scraping against a window. The noise continued for a few seconds, then stopped. I got up and opened the door, standing in the dark corridor. My hand rested on the switch, but I hesitated to turn on the light. I looked around and saw only the old wallpaper and the floorboards. I tried to listen for any hint of movement. Nothing happened. My heart felt like it was pounding in my ears. After a minute, I closed the door and went back to bed, but my sleep was restless. The next morning, I noticed that a chair in the downstairs study was positioned differently. I remembered leaving it tucked under the desk. Now it was at an angle, facing the door. I assumed I might have left it that way, so I pushed it back. I made coffee and started sorting through old books, hoping to distract myself. Later, when I took a break, I walked into the study again. The chair was slightly off-center once more. It was such a small detail, but it made me feel uneasy. I opened the windows to let in fresh air, hoping that some breeze had shifted it. Yet the movement seemed deliberate. That night, around midnight, I decided to go to the attic window. I needed a place to think. The upstairs halls were dark. I held a small flashlight, stepping carefully to avoid making noise. Once in the attic, I moved a dusty chair near the window. Outside, I only saw darkness and the outline of trees on the slope below. Inside, everything was silent. Then, I heard a soft knock on the attic door. The knock was light and paced at intervals of a few seconds. I got up and moved toward the door. My chest felt tight. I hesitated before gripping the handle. When I opened it, the hallway was empty. No one was there. My pulse hammered inside my head. A faint, unfamiliar scent lingered in the air, something I could not identify. I closed the door and locked it. My hands shook. I stood there for a while, waiting to see if I would hear the knock again. The rest of the night was quiet. Over the next few days, I tried to ignore these occurrences. I focused on my books and tasks. But it seemed like the more I brushed things aside, the more the house responded. A few times, I heard a book fall from a shelf in another room. I would rush in to see a single book lying open on the floor, spine facing up. No gust of wind or reason for it to tumble. Sometimes the closet door in my bedroom would be a few inches open in the morning, despite my habit of shutting it firmly at night. I started to feel as though something was testing me, observing how I reacted. By the second week, I felt a constant tension in my shoulders. My neck was sore from being on alert. Even when I tried to relax, I would catch the smallest sounds or movements. On one occasion, I walked toward the kitchen and heard a scratchy noise coming from the dining room. I paused in the hallway and listened carefully. It sounded like a rough fabric sliding against wood. When I peeked inside, the noise stopped. My hands felt cold and clammy, and my mouth went dry. I hated how powerless I felt, but I had no idea what to do. I began having trouble sleeping. I stayed up late in bed, eyes on the ceiling, listening for the faintest sound. Some nights were quiet. Other nights the house would make me jump with sudden pops or knocks. My thoughts raced. I questioned whether I was imagining these things. In the morning, I would try to convince myself I was overreacting. But then I would see a small change. An object moved, a door out of place, and my nerves would spike again. On a Wednesday around 3 a.m., I was still awake. I decided to sit by the bedroom window. I kept the light off and just stared at the sky. After a while, I heard another knock in the hallway. This time it was faint but consistent. I got up and opened the door. The corridor was empty, lit only by a distant glow from the downstairs lamp. I stepped forward. The knock seemed to shift to the other end of the hall. I followed it, my heart beating hard. I reached the far end, but heard nothing. I turned back, feeling a pang of dread. The air felt thicker. My stomach churned. I hurried back to my room, closed the door, and sat on the bed, trying to steady my breath. Despite these incidents, there were no direct threats. I never found any evidence of someone living secretly in the house. I never saw a figure or a face. The biggest impact was psychological. My body responded with shivers and racing thoughts. My heartbeat would spike at the smallest noise, and I would break into a sweat if I heard something behind me. My skin crawled at the idea of being watched by something I could not identify. There were times I thought about leaving early, but I had tasks I needed to finish. One afternoon, I stood in the upstairs hallway, thinking about how to handle the situation. My hands were clenched, and my throat felt tight. I realized that I was no longer comfortable walking around without a flashlight, even during the day. The floors made me feel exposed. Every step reminded me that this place had its own presence. I stopped trying to dismiss it and accepted that I felt uneasy. When the wooden boards creaked and nothing else moved, my nerves tensed anyway. I would check each corner before proceeding. On my last evening there, I sat in the downstairs living room. The air felt cold. I checked the thermostat, and it read normal. I put on a sweater and tried to focus on a stack of books. A dull thump came from the wall behind me, but I resisted the urge to check. A few minutes later, I heard another slight noise, closer this time. My breath caught in my throat. I stood up and took a few steps toward the door. The noise stopped. I felt the hairs on my arms stand on end. I felt watched again, but I could not see anything. The silence was thick. My mind raced, and my stomach felt like it was in knots. I walked to the front hallway, grabbed my coat, and decided to leave the house for a short walk around the property. I wanted fresh air. My legs were shaky as I headed outside. I did not stay outdoors for very long. It was dark, and my flashlight beam revealed twisted bushes and thick trees. I heard normal sounds of the night, crickets and occasional rustling in the undergrowth. I felt a bit calmer out there, but I knew I had to return inside sooner or later. When I went back in, I locked the door, went straight to my bedroom, and moved a chair against the door. I fell asleep after several hours of tossing and turning. Early the next morning, I packed my belongings. I felt relieved to be leaving. I walked through the rooms one last time, double-checking for anything I might have forgotten. The house looked the same, but I carried the weight of every strange noise and every unexplained occurrence. I felt a knot in my stomach as I closed the front door. I stood on the porch, inhaled once, and walked down the hill to wait for my ride. My hands were trembling. I knew I would remember that tension for a long time. I heard nothing behind me as I left, but I felt a slight chill on the back of my neck. I did not look back. I just waited for the car to arrive, counting the seconds until I could leave that property behind. I drove up the dirt path and saw the farmhouse in the distance. The fields around it looked calm. I got out of the car, stretched my legs, and took a good look at the main building. It was a modest, two-story structure, painted white, with a large porch. I was here to help with house chores and to organize some old family documents. The owners seemed friendly when I first spoke to them on the phone, so I expected a quiet stay. However, something in my gut told me the property carried a heavier atmosphere than what I had anticipated. I wanted to ignore that feeling, but it stuck with me. On my first afternoon, I settled into a small room on the upper floor. The walls had a light cream color, and there were no paintings or decorations, just a narrow bed and a wooden dresser. A single window overlooked the fields. After unpacking, I decided to look around. I went down the stairs and found my hosts outside, busy with some farm tasks. They waved and told me to feel free to check the house. I noticed a slight tremor in my hand when I placed it on the doorknob leading to the old barn. I could not explain why I felt tense. The barn had been converted into a makeshift library. Inside, I saw rows of shelves, boxes stacked on the floor, and a few chairs set against the walls. The space smelled of dust and dry hay. It felt ordinary enough, yet my stomach churned. I wandered to the far corner of the barn. There was a large bookcase with boxes of documents on the lower shelves. The air felt thicker there, like someone watching me. I turned around quickly, scanning the entire barn. Nothing unusual. I exhaled and forced a small laugh at my own nerves. I grabbed a box of old records and started browsing them. After a few minutes, my attention drifted again to that same corner. I still sensed a presence, though I saw nothing. My heartbeat rose, and I quickly packed the papers back into the box. I left the barn, feeling a thin layer of sweat on my neck. That night, I ate dinner with the family. They were polite, and we chatted about farming, the upcoming season, and the tasks I would be handling. After dinner, I returned to my room. I sat on the bed, looking around. Everything felt too quiet. The windows were closed, and the only sound was the ticking of an old clock in the hallway. My body felt heavy, and my mind seemed alert to every noise. Then I heard a faint creak on the floor above me. I got up, opened my door, and looked into the hallway. The ceiling lamp provided a weak glow. I knew there were some unused rooms on the upper level. The family had mentioned storage areas and old furniture, but I was certain no one else was up there. I listened for another sound. Silence. My hands felt clammy, so I closed the door and tried to sleep. The next morning, I decided to explore the upper rooms. One of them was almost empty, except for a small bench against the wall and a little wooden rocking horse in the corner. It seemed out of place. It had chipped paint and looked like it had not been touched for decades. I approached it and ran my hand over the curved edge. Immediately, I felt a chill sweep through my arms. My heart fluttered. I pulled my hand back, unsure why that object bothered me. I left the room and walked downstairs, reminding myself that everything was probably normal. Later that day, I spent time sorting through documents in the barn. The afternoon sun was warm, and I started to relax. It felt good to organize the old papers and set them in labeled piles. But every now and then, a wave of unease crept into my thoughts. I tried to shake it off by focusing on the tasks. By sundown, I headed back to the main house to wash up and eat. My mood lifted a bit. I carried a sense of routine that calmed me. Around bedtime, I climbed the stairs to my room. I paused when I heard the same creaking noise above me. This time, it had a rhythmic quality, like something gently shifting. I imagined the rocking horse in the dark, moving back and forth on the wooden floor. My pulse sped up, and I forced myself to push the thought out of my head. I entered my room, shut the door, and got ready for bed. I tried to read, but my thoughts wandered to the possibility of that rocking horse swaying alone. I shook my head and told myself it was just an overactive imagination. By the third or fourth day, I could not deny the persistent feeling that I was never alone. When I walked through the hallway, I felt as though someone was right behind me, matching my steps. I sometimes turned around fast, expecting to catch a person standing there. The corridor was always empty. My chest tightened, and I would inhale deeply to calm down. Each time I stepped into a new room, I waited a second before turning on the lights, half afraid I might see something I could not explain. In the afternoons, I continued working in the barn library. One day, I came across a file with photos. They showed the old farmhouse, the barn, and a few family gatherings. There was nothing unusual in the pictures, except for one detail. In the background of one photo, I spotted the small rocking horse on the porch. It looked the same as the one upstairs, just with less paint wear. I felt my scalp prickle. The photo was dated many years ago, but it confirmed the horse had been around for a long time. I started noticing a pattern in the behavior of the other residents. Whenever I brought up any slight mention of odd noises or strange feelings, they would quickly change the subject. They wore polite smiles, but their eyes seemed distant. One evening, I asked the eldest family member if the rocking horse had belonged to someone in the house. He paused, looked away, and said it was just an old toy. His tone told me to stop asking. I dropped the subject. That night, I found it hard to rest. On another day, while I was moving boxes around in the barn, I heard the door squeak. I glanced back. No one came in. The door stood half open, letting in a slice of sunlight. My pulse quickened. I stood still, waiting to see if someone had opened it. After a few seconds, nothing happened. I went to close it and felt that same charged air, like a static buzzing around me. I dashed outside, needing the fresh air. My breath came in shallow bursts, and my chest felt tight. I tried to regain my composure before going back in. That incident bothered me more than it should have. Days went by, and the tension built inside me. Each time I organized papers in the barn, I could not shake the idea that something hovered in the corner. The old rocking horse upstairs weighed on my mind. At night, I heard faint noises in the upper rooms. It sometimes sounded like a soft scraping of wood on wood. I would freeze in place, counting my heartbeats, straining my ears. Then, silence. My throat would feel dry, and my hands trembled slightly. I wanted to ask about it again, but everyone in the farmhouse kept the conversation focused on daily chores and local gossip. They never mentioned anything strange. One afternoon, I mustered the courage to head back upstairs to that room with the rocking horse. I told myself I wanted to see if it had moved. When I entered, I noticed the horse looked angled toward the doorway, as if it had shifted. It was not a big change, but it was enough to make my stomach twist. I stood there, staring at it, searching for a rational reason. I thought maybe someone had cleaned or moved it, but I had seen no signs of dusting or sweeping. The paint chips were in the same spots, the dust on the floor unchanged. My skin tingled, and I fought the urge to run out. Instead, I forced myself to step closer. The silence weighed on me. My ears picked up the sound of my own breathing, sharp and shallow. After a moment of hesitation, I crouched and touched the horse again. My fingertips felt cold, and my heartbeat pounded in my ears. I stood up and left the room, making sure to note the exact angle of the horse's position. I wanted to confirm later if it moved again. During my final week, the sounds grew more frequent. Low creaks in the hallway, small taps on the walls, faint footsteps in rooms I knew to be empty. I felt less surprised each time it happened, though my body still reacted with tension. My shoulders stayed stiff and my jaw clenched. I drank more water than usual, trying to keep my mouth from going dry. In the evenings, I sometimes saw shadows flicker in the corners of my vision. Every time I turned my head, the shadows vanished. No matter how many times I reminded myself it was likely the light playing tricks, I could not fully dismiss the sense that I was being watched. One night I was up late, reading old records. A door down the hall creaked softly. I sat up, listening. The rest of the house was quiet, and the family had gone to bed hours ago. The floor felt solid under my feet, but my nerves were on edge. I crept to the hallway and noticed the door to the upper room was slightly open. I had left it closed. My breathing grew rapid, and I debated whether to shut it or ignore it. I took a few slow steps forward, my pulse in my throat. I nudged the door. The room lay in darkness. I reached for the light switch and turned it on. The rocking horse was in its usual corner, angled the same as I had seen before. My heart pounded. I stood there, scanning the dusty floor, checking for footprints or marks. I saw nothing. I flipped off the light, closed the door carefully, and hurried back to my room. My fingers shook when I tried to lock my door. The last day arrived. I completed most of my work and packed my things. There was a final set of documents to place in a metal cabinet near the barn's rear wall. I carried them outside and stepped in, noticing how the barn felt stuffy. I placed the documents in the cabinet and paused. A soft noise reached my ears from the far side of the barn, like someone shifting a chair. My stomach tightened. I called out to see if a family member was there. No answer. I looked around, but no one was in sight. A sudden wave of coldness washed over me. I felt goosebumps on my arms. Without thinking, I hurried toward the exit, leaving the barn door half open. That night, I said my goodbyes at dinner. I tried to keep the conversation light, talking about how much I appreciated their hospitality. They seemed polite but avoided direct eye contact. I finished packing and placed my bags by the front door. I laid in bed, listening to the usual night sounds. Crickets chirped. The wind rustled. Every so often I heard a faint creak from somewhere upstairs. My stomach clenched at each noise, but I was almost gone. I told myself I could endure one more night. In the morning, I carried my luggage to the car. My host came out to thank me for my work. I smiled and said I was grateful for the chance to stay. He nodded, as if guessing my unease. I glanced at the window to the upper floor. The curtains were drawn, and I imagined that old rocking horse behind them. I did not expect an answer to the strangeness. I just wanted to leave. I got in the car, started the engine, and drove down the dirt road. The tension in my shoulders lessened with each mile I put between myself and that farmhouse. Yet I could not forget the steady sensation of being watched, nor the subtle sounds that haunted the quiet corners of that place. I gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual. As I left the property behind, I felt a chill course through me one last time, like a farewell from whatever presence lingered in those old rooms. I did not look back. I focused on the road ahead. I knew I would remember the unease long after I reached my next destination. Arrived in the far north on a cold afternoon. My plan was to stay near a small settlement at the edge of the Arctic region. I wanted to experience the long nights, see the auroras, and feel the silence of the ice. I had packed thick coats, gloves, and all the gear I thought I would need. The flight to the closest airport was calm. Then I took a short drive with a local resident. He dropped me off at a modest cabin, about 1 kilometer from the main cluster of small houses. He handed me a key and told me where to find extra firewood. I thanked him, stepped onto the icy ground, and looked around at the wide, empty landscape. Inside the cabin, I found a small heater and a cot with extra blankets. I organized my things, checked my supplies, and opened a metal thermos for a hot drink. My ears felt sensitive to every small noise. Even my footsteps seemed louder than normal on the wooden floor. I could feel the cold air pressing against the walls. The region outside was mostly white and gray, with patches of rocks poking through the snow. The sky was a pale color that hinted at dusk, though it was only mid-afternoon. I grabbed my coat and decided to step outside for a short walk to take in the atmosphere. The cold bit at my skin the instant I opened the door. My breath formed small clouds. I walked a few meters away from the cabin and looked at the horizon. Low hills and flat tundra stretched out. I heard almost nothing except a faint breeze. My boots crunched on the hardened snow. The feeling of isolation was strong. I liked it at first because it felt like a peaceful escape. But something in my gut felt a bit uneasy. I tried to brush that aside. I assumed it was just my excitement mixing with nerves. By early evening, the sky had darkened. I sat on a small bench outside, watching faint colors move across the horizon. The auroras started to appear, green curtains shifting and drifting. I turned off my flashlight to let my eyes adjust. Then, after a few minutes of silence, I heard an odd sound. It was metallic and steady, like a slow, rhythmic clank. I stood up, searching for the source. I saw no machinery, no vehicles, nothing. The sound was faint but clear. I listened carefully, trying to guess if it was ice shifting or maybe a distant generator. The noise didn't match anything I recognized. My scalp tingled. Then the sound stopped as suddenly as it began. I felt confused. My first instinct was to check the horizon, see if anyone was out there. The darkness made it difficult to see far, but the moonlight and the reflections from the snow gave enough dim light to spot movement. I saw nothing. I waited a bit longer, stepping in slow circles around the cabin. The sound did not return. Eventually, I went back inside and secured the door. My heart pounded in my ears. I told myself it had to be some natural ice effect, but it still unsettled me. The next day, I spoke briefly with a local at a small shop in the settlement. I asked if there was any known source of strange metallic noises out on the tundra. The person gave me a puzzled look and shrugged. He said the only machinery around belonged to the occasional snowmobile or generator for the local power supply, and I might hear them from time to time. But what I described did not fit. He suggested I might have imagined it. I left feeling a little embarrassed, but the tension in my chest remained. The second night, I decided to head farther out to watch the auroras. I walked carefully, wearing a headlamp. I stopped at a spot about 200 meters from my cabin where the snow was more level. I clicked off the light, looked up, and waited for my eyes to adjust. The sky was full of shifting colors, faint but mesmerizing. At first, everything was silent. I felt a slight breeze on my cheeks. Then, after several minutes, I heard that same metallic, rhythmic sound. It started low, like a distant drip of metal against metal, then grew louder, though never deafening. My pulse quickened. I scanned the sky and the horizon. I spotted 3 distinct lights overhead. They didn't look like stars or satellites. They shone brighter and didn't move in the typical path of planes or anything I'd seen before. They grew brighter for a few seconds. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were part of the auroras or some atmospheric phenomenon. But my heart hammered in my chest. The metallic noise synchronized with their brightness, as if connected. Then, without warning, the lights vanished. The sky was back to normal. The sound cut off instantly. I was left staring at empty darkness and weak aurora trails. My hands felt stiff with cold, but I also realized I had been holding my breath. I exhaled and took a few steps back toward my cabin. My heart was pounding so hard that I felt my chest tighten. I switched on my headlamp, half expecting to see something behind me. Nothing was there. I hurried back inside, locked the door, and slid my back down against the wall until I was sitting on the floor. My breathing was ragged, and my mind kept replaying that sound. I tried to calm down by checking my watch. I felt like I'd only been outside for 15 or 20 minutes. The watch showed a different time than I expected. Over an hour had passed. I double-checked my phone, but it showed the same time as the watch. I had lost track of at least 40 minutes. My skin crawled. I tried to recall every moment, but it felt like my memory jumped from the lights to me standing near the door of the cabin. I reasoned that maybe I'd gotten too absorbed in the sky, but something about that gap felt wrong. The following day, I drove my small rented vehicle into the settlement. expecting to see lights on in the houses and the main building where some locals gathered. Instead, I found the place oddly still. A few people were out, but they seemed quieter than usual. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard, then at a clock mounted in the settlement's community center. The difference was more than 2 hours. I felt a chill run through my body. It was as if my sense of time had completely misaligned. I asked someone about the time, but he answered in short phrases, as if he thought the question was strange. I got no explanation. My heart raced, and my stomach twisted. The metal taste of fear spread on my tongue. That night I decided to try staying in the cabin, hoping to avoid the confusion. But as darkness fell, my mind replayed the events. My stomach felt tense. My ears seemed to pick up every tiny noise from outside, the wind, the snow shifting. I almost expected to hear that metallic sound again. I stepped outside for a breath of fresh air around midnight. The sky was partially cloudy, and I saw only the glow of faint auroras behind the clouds. I walked around the cabin, shining my flashlight along the walls and the nearby snow. Nothing looked suspicious. I stood still, letting the cold nip at my face. Then I went back in and tried to sleep. I woke to find the clock on my phone showing a time far later than I expected. I had planned to wake up early, but my phone claimed it was almost noon. I rubbed my eyes and checked my watch. The watch said it was still around 9 a.m. I felt the hair on my arms stand on end. I flipped through my phone's settings, but nothing looked off. I tried connecting to the local network, but my service was spotty. Confused, I decided to head to the settlement again. I found the main building locked, and the windows showed no light inside. I tapped on the door. No one answered. I felt panic building. When I finally located a resident, he shrugged and said maybe the clock in the building had broken. He seemed unwilling to discuss anything about odd time shifts or missing hours. I left feeling unsettled. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel, heading back to the cabin. Thoughts swirled in my mind. Had I experienced some bizarre lapse in awareness? Was there an explanation related to the polar twilight conditions? I couldn't make sense of it. My chest felt tight, and I had to stop the vehicle momentarily to gather my wits. Over the next few days, I tried to continue my routine. I'd step outside, gaze at the auroras, and take notes on what I saw. But each time I looked up at the sky, I felt dread. My muscles tensed at the slightest noise. I found myself glancing at the horizon often, expecting those strange lights to appear again. Occasionally, I'd notice subtle flickers in my peripheral vision, but I never saw the same trio of lights I'd witnessed before. The metallic noise did not return, though I thought I heard faint clicks when the wind was quiet. The locals remained polite but distant. Whenever I tried to share my concerns or ask about missing hours, they changed the subject or gave short answers. I sensed that something about this region was not open for discussion. It felt as if they had encountered similar anomalies before and had decided to ignore or dismiss them. My mouth felt dry each time I attempted to bring it up. My heart pounded as though warning me not to push the topic. I realized I was becoming jittery at night, checking the cabin windows, stepping onto the porch with a flashlight, and scanning the empty landscape. On my final evening, I gathered my belongings, planning an early departure. I intended to leave before dawn. Around midnight, I heard a distant hum outside. I froze. My mouth went dry, and my heart hammered in my chest. I turned off the lights inside the cabin and crept to the window. The sky had a faint glow from the auroras. I didn't see anything unusual at first. Then, in the distance, 3 small points of light appeared and seemed to hover for a few seconds. They flickered, pulsed, and vanished. No metallic noise accompanied them this time, but the sensation was enough to make my hands sweat. I felt my legs shaking, and I stepped away from the window. I sank onto my bed, breathing unevenly, trying to calm down. When morning arrived, I wasted no time. I packed the last items into the vehicle, locked the cabin, and drove off. As I passed the settlement, I noticed fewer people than usual. The few I saw watched me in silence as I drove by. My stomach churned. I reached the small local airstrip, returned the keys to the car, and waited with my bag slung over my shoulder. The flight out was delayed, which meant I stood in the small terminal building for nearly an hour. The heater struggled to keep the space warm. I checked my watch and my phone. Both displayed different times again. A jolt of anxiety shot through me. I stared at the phone, trying to remember if I'd changed any settings. Nothing made sense. Eventually, my flight was called. I boarded the small plane with a handful of other passengers. No one spoke. I sat by a window, watching the ground vanish below. The frozen landscape spread out in all directions. I tried not to think about the missing hours, the lights, or the metallic sound. But my heart still raced, and my hands felt stiff around the armrests. I kept looking at my watch, watching each minute tick by, half expecting time to skip again. When we landed in a larger town, the clocks and the phone networks returned to normal. The sense of unreality faded a bit, but the tension lingered in my chest. I realized my memories of certain nights in the cabin felt disjointed. I had no logical explanation for the strange lights or the time lapses. People I spoke with later gave me skeptical looks or patronizing smiles when I tried to recount my experience. I tried to move on, but I still think about those moments in the Arctic. I remember the metallic echo, the bright pinpoints of light, and the unexplained gap of time. I recall the sharp, cold air stinging my cheeks, and the eerie calm that settled after each unusual event. I don't have any answers. I just know that when I close my eyes at night, I sometimes see those lights blinking, and I hear that distant metallic rhythm in my mind. My stomach still tightens at the memory. I haven't gone back to that part of the world. I doubt I ever will, but I will never forget those long Arctic nights and the unsettling sense that something out there defied my understanding of time and sound. I realized something was wrong the day I felt a chill run through me for no clear reason. I had been living alone in a small apartment for a few years. My routine was predictable. I worked part-time from home, studied old documents in the evenings, and enjoyed reading at night. The apartment was not fancy. I had a modest couch, a small kitchen table, and shelves packed with books. I liked the quiet, or I thought I did. But something changed one afternoon when I was reorganizing my notes and realized I felt a strange sense of déjà vu. My body tensed, and my hands started trembling. I stood near the window, trying to ground myself by focusing on the view outside. It was just the usual street scene, with a few cars and some pedestrians, yet I could not shake the feeling that I had been there, in that exact moment, discussing the same topic with someone who was no longer around. It made no sense. I tried to dismiss that eerie sensation as simple confusion. I went to the kitchen, made a quick snack, and forced myself to watch some mindless videos on my laptop. My heart eventually calmed. That night, I decided to organize more papers and see if I could keep my mind busy. While I was stacking the papers, I heard a soft creak in the hallway that leads to the bedroom. My apartment is small, so every sound is usually easy to identify. This time, I had no idea what made that noise. I paused, my chest feeling tight. The light in the living room was on, so the hallway was dim. I waited, expecting another noise. Nothing happened. I let out a slow breath and tried to refocus on my notes. A few days later, the sense of repetition grew stronger. I was typing on my laptop when I suddenly saw an image in my mind. Me, in the same room, but with someone else sitting on the couch, talking about a topic I could not quite remember. It felt vivid. My stomach clenched and my heart beat faster. I turned my head, half expecting to see a person there. The couch was empty. I felt my skin grow cold. I got up to check the hallway and the kitchen. Everything was normal. I told myself I was stressed or overtired. I even considered the possibility of old memories blending with random thoughts. But the intensity rattled me. That evening, I decided to take a bath to calm my nerves. I filled the tub, turned on a bit of music, and tried to relax. 20 minutes in, I heard faint footsteps outside the bathroom door. My body froze. The footsteps were soft, as though someone were pacing slowly in the hallway. I listened carefully. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. I almost expected the door to open. I knew I lived alone, so I felt vulnerable. The footsteps stopped. I quickly got out of the tub, dried myself as fast as possible, and wrapped myself in a robe. When I unlocked the door and peeked out, the hallway was empty. My breathing felt shallow, and I sensed a slight dizziness. I checked every corner of the apartment. Nothing was out of place, and no one was there. I decided not to mention it to anyone, because I had no way of explaining it. My anxiety kept building after that. Some nights later, around 2 a.m., I woke up with a jolt. I thought I heard a muffled voice in the living room. I lay still in bed, my chest pounding. The voice sounded like mine, but slightly altered, maybe deeper. I could not make out any words. My throat felt dry, and I reached for my phone. I turned on the flashlight feature and slid out of bed, stepping carefully across the floor. The light illuminated the bedroom door and the short hallway. I held my breath, expecting to see something. When I reached the living room, no one was there. The silence was unnerving. Even the hum of the refrigerator sounded louder than usual. The tension in my muscles made my neck ache. I stood there for a minute, scanning the room with my phone's light. Nothing moved. I swallowed hard and returned to bed, though I didn't sleep well for the rest of the night. In the following days, I began to notice tiny details that unnerved me. A pencil would be on the table when I swore I had placed it on the shelf. My slippers would be angled differently than I remembered. The door to a cabinet would be slightly ajar, even though I usually keep all doors closed. None of these incidents were dramatic, but they chipped away at my sense of security. Each time, I questioned my own memory. My stomach would tighten, and my pulse would speed up. I tried to convince myself I was just distracted or forgetful. But deep down, I felt something else was at play. One afternoon, I was dusting my bookshelf when I got another intense flash of a moment that never happened in my conscious memory. I saw myself standing in that exact spot, holding the same book, but the scene felt like it belonged to a different time. My body tensed, my hands started sweating, and I nearly dropped the book. It felt as though I was recalling an event from an alternate timeline. I steadied my breathing, telling myself it was a simple mental glitch, but my heart kept pounding. As the days went by, these experiences escalated. Sometimes I would hear a faint knock on my front door, but when I opened it, no one stood in the hallway. Other times, I would see a flicker at the corner of my eye, like a shadow. My chest would feel hot, and my muscles would clench in anticipation of something happening. Yet I never witnessed a clear shape or person. The terror came from not knowing. My rational mind wanted a physical explanation, but my immediate reaction was raw fear. About a week later, I decided to start keeping a small notebook to track each strange event. I thought maybe I could find a pattern or prove to myself it was all in my head. I noted the times I heard odd sounds, saw objects slightly moved, or felt that uncanny déjà vu. At first, the entries were scattered, but as I recorded more details, I noticed that these odd events often coincided with me focusing on certain old books or certain topics in my notes. That realization made me uneasy. My stomach churned whenever I saw connections that seemed impossible to explain. Late one night, I was writing in the notebook when I heard the distinct sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were more pronounced this time, heavier than before, almost methodical. My spine tingled. I set the notebook aside and quietly stood up. I felt my throat tighten. I took a few cautious steps toward the hallway, every muscle in my body tense. The steps stopped abruptly. My hands were cold and sweaty. I tried to flick on the hallway light, but it took a second for the switch to respond. The bulb glowed weakly, revealing an empty corridor. My mouth felt dry, and I could hear my own heartbeat. I said nothing. I just stared, half expecting to see someone step out from a corner, but it stayed empty. Another night, I was up late reading, drifting between consciousness and drowsiness. I glanced at the mirror in the corridor when I got up to grab a glass of water. For a split second, I thought I saw an older version of myself in the reflection, watching me. I froze in place, my breath catching in my throat. I blinked. My reflection returned to normal, yet my body shook. My mind spun with confusion and fear. I hurried into the kitchen, not wanting to look at the mirror again. I barely slept that night, pacing in the living room and checking the time on my phone every few minutes. Gradually, I accepted that something was off, and I had no direct way to fight it. There was no intruder. I found no signs of forced entry or tampering. It was almost like I was losing the boundary between my memories, my imagination, and my present reality. That uncertainty wore me down. My eyes felt tired from constant vigilance. My shoulders ached from tension. I began to dread the night. Even the simplest routine, like brushing my teeth, felt charged with anxiety, as though I might glimpse something behind me in the mirror, or hear that deep voice through the walls. One afternoon, I received a call from a friend who wanted to come by. I made an excuse, saying I was busy. In truth, I worried that if someone else entered my apartment, they might stir up more confusion. Or worse, they might confirm that something truly strange was happening. I was torn between wanting proof and wanting ignorance. A few days before I finally decided to move out, I had the most intense experience. I was napping on the couch with the television on. I woke suddenly, thinking I heard my own voice in the kitchen. I sat up, feeling a chill all over my body. The voice repeated a short phrase, something like, "I told you this would happen," but it sounded garbled. My heart raced as I crept toward the kitchen door. My legs felt weak. I saw no one. I heard no more voices. But the sense that I had spoken to myself from another room was overwhelming. I nearly ran out of the apartment right then, but I forced myself to stay calm. My hands shook so badly that I had trouble opening a bottle of water. That final week, I packed up my essentials, telling myself I needed a break. I kept hearing small creaks and occasional soft knocks as I boxed my belongings. Each noise made me pause and look around with a pounding heart. I couldn't ignore how on edge I felt. My chest felt tight, and my breathing was shallow. I worried that I might be unraveling mentally, but the physical details, moved objects, the footsteps, the déjà vu, seemed too real to be mere imagination. On my last night, I sat alone in the living room. The lights were on, and the apartment was mostly empty because I had moved out much of the furniture and boxes earlier that day. The space felt more open, making every sound echo. I decided to stay awake. Around midnight, I heard the soft clicking of the hallway lamp like it was flickering. I got up to check. The hallway was dim, but the bulb wasn't flickering. I stared into that small space, feeling my heartbeat hammer my ribs. I heard a faint whisper in my ear, my own voice, but reversed somehow, like a warped recording. My scalp prickled, and I backed away. Nothing was there. I grabbed my coat and left the apartment, my heart racing. I couldn't spend another minute there. The next day, I returned with a couple of friends to grab the remaining boxes. I did not bring up what had happened. I just wanted to leave. The tension in my body was obvious. My hands felt clammy, and I kept glancing at the hallway as we carried out the last items. Neither friend mentioned anything strange, though they noticed I was jumpy. We locked the door for the final time, handed the keys to the building manager, and walked away. My entire body felt heavy, but also relieved. Since moving out, I've tried to focus on normal routines. I still have nightmares about hearing my own voice in another room or catching a glimpse of something impossible in the mirror. I can't fully explain what happened in that apartment. I have no evidence that I wasn't hallucinating or losing track of time. But my physical reactions felt real. My racing heart, my sweaty palms, my trembling voice whenever I tried to speak about it. It felt like the boundaries of time and memory were blurred. I don't think I'll ever forget the constant dread and the sense that my own life was splitting into fragments. I've learned to avoid mirrors late at night, and I keep my living space simpler now. I rarely discuss the details with anyone because I don't know how to articulate the experience without sounding unhinged. But it happened. The footsteps, the voices, the shifted objects. Those moments convinced me that fear can thrive in small, quiet spaces, relying only on the cracks in our understanding of time. And once you feel that uncertainty, it's hard to ignore. Even now, when I walk down a dim hallway, I brace myself for another impossible echo, waiting for me on the other side. Stepped out of the hired car and immediately noticed the silence around the Old Mountain Hotel. The driver handed me my small suitcase, gave a polite nod, and left without saying much. I was too tired from the long trip to pay attention to his hurried manner. I had come here for a short vacation, hoping for peace and quiet. The building looked sturdy, though aged. The wooden walls appeared dark in the late afternoon light, and the tall windows gave the place a solemn look. I walked up the few steps to the lobby door, feeling a slight chill despite the mild weather. Inside, the lobby felt almost empty. I saw a single receptionist behind a tall wooden counter. He greeted me with a flat expression and asked for my name. His voice sounded distant, as though he was distracted. I noticed old paintings on the walls, mostly landscapes of nearby mountains. The air carried a faint smell of varnish and something else I could not place. The place felt calm, yet something made my pulse quicken. I tried to brush off the sensation and gave the man my reservation details. The check-in process went quickly. He handed me a key attached to a heavy keychain. "Room 12, down the second-floor hallway," he said. I thanked him and turned to find the elevator. It stood at the end of the corridor, an older model with a metal grate. The interior light flickered for a second when I pressed the button for the second floor. The elevator rose with a slight jolt, making my stomach tense. I reminded myself that older buildings often had quirks. When I stepped out of the elevator, I expected to see more guests in the hallway. Instead, the corridor was empty. The thick carpet muted my footsteps. I passed several closed doors with tarnished number plates. Room 9, 10, 11. Finally, I reached room 12. I inserted the key, turned it, and heard the lock click. The door creaked as I pushed it open. My room was simple. There was a bed, a small table with a lamp, and a dresser by the window. A single armchair faced the window, and on a small table nearby sat an empty vase. The walls were covered in dark wood paneling, giving the space a dull atmosphere. I placed my suitcase on the bed and tested the lamp. It worked, but the bulb was weak. I decided to open the curtains and let in a bit of natural light. Outside, I saw only a small courtyard below, with a few parked cars and a tall fence. No one appeared to be walking around. I sat on the bed to rest. My back felt stiff from the travel. The mattress sagged a bit in the middle. I heard a faint sound in the hallway, maybe footsteps, but they faded quickly. I reminded myself that this was an older hotel, so minor noises were normal. Still, a subtle tightness remained in my chest, like an unease I couldn't define. That evening, I went downstairs to find dinner. The dining area was off to the left of the lobby. A single server stood near the entrance, greeting me with a nod. The room had several tables, but only 2 other guests were present, both sitting alone. One older woman read a book. A man, seated at a corner table, stared out the window. They didn't acknowledge me. I took a seat by the opposite wall. The server brought me a menu and pointed out the daily specials. I felt self-conscious in the quiet environment, like everyone could hear me breathe. After dinner, I returned to my room, planning to read. The hallway lights were dim, creating patches of shadow. A mirror on the wall reflected the faint glow. As I passed by, I caught a glimpse of movement in that reflection. I turned quickly, but the corridor behind me was empty. My pulse spiked. I moved on, telling myself it was a trick of the low light. In my room, I turned on the lamp and tried to focus on a book. My mind kept drifting back to that glimpse in the mirror. My hands felt cold, and my neck muscles were tight. The silence in the hotel made every small creak in the hallway or shift of the floor sound amplified. After an hour of restless reading, I decided to go to bed. Before turning off the lamp, I noticed the empty vase on the table looked slightly shifted from earlier. I couldn't be sure, but I thought I had left it more centered. I pushed the thought aside and switched off the light. I woke at around 2 a.m. to a soft noise near the door. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then I heard it again, a faint knock or scratch at the door. My heart thudded in my chest, and I listened for more. Nothing else came. I sat up in bed, debating if I should check. I slid out from under the covers, feeling a cold rush of air against my skin. I approached the door, placed my ear against it, and waited. I heard only my own breathing. After a few moments of silence, I flicked on the room's light and opened the door. The hallway was empty. Tension built in my stomach, but I tried to calm myself. I closed the door again, locked it, and returned to bed. It took a while to fall asleep, my mind cycling through thoughts of what might have caused that sound. The next morning, I woke late. My body felt heavy. I decided to explore the nearby trails after breakfast. The lobby, again, was mostly empty. The receptionist gave me a nod, but his face showed little interest. I stepped outside into the crisp mountain air, trying to shrug off the unease from last night. The sun felt good on my face. I followed a short hiking path that wound behind the hotel. The trail led to a small overlook where I could see the valleys below. The view was impressive. The fresh air helped clear my head. For a few moments, I felt at ease. Returning to the hotel in the afternoon, I passed by the parking area. I noticed only a couple of cars. It struck me how few guests seemed to be here. I entered through the main doors, and the receptionist gave me a polite but vacant look. I asked if many people were staying here this season, and he responded with a vague comment about low tourism at this time of year. I thanked him and made my way upstairs. That evening, the tension in the hallways grew. The lights were still dim, and I thought I heard a faint whisper when I walked by the mirror. My heartbeat raced. I tried to focus on my steps. A single lamp flickered at the far end of the corridor. I thought I saw a shape pass by that light, but when I blinked, nothing was there. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to keep walking until I reached my door. Inside my room, I switched on the lamp and checked the corners out of habit. Everything looked normal, if dull and worn. The vase on the table seemed off-center again. I stepped closer and found it had indeed moved. Only a slight shift, but enough to make my stomach twist. I stood there, staring, trying to recall if the cleaning staff might have touched it. There was no reason for them to move that empty vase. I set it back to its original position, my fingers shaking. I decided not to dwell on it, though my pulse remained high. That night, I tried to relax by taking a hot shower. The bathroom was small, with a single overhead light. The water pressure was decent. As I rinsed my hair, I heard a clicking sound from somewhere in the bedroom. I froze, letting the water run over my shoulders. Another click echoed. It sounded like the lamp switch or a door handle. My hands tensed, and I quickly turned off the shower. Stepping out carefully, I wrapped myself in a towel and listened. The hotel seemed quiet except for a faint hum from the bathroom fan. My heart was racing. I dried off, put on clean clothes, and opened the bathroom door. The lamp in the main room was off, though I had left it on. My breath caught in my throat. My arms felt cold. I crept to the lamp and flipped the switch. It lit up again, as if nothing was wrong. But I knew I hadn't turned it off. Unable to sleep, I sat on the bed, the lamp shining next to me. My mind jumped to the previous knocks and the vase moving. My scalp tingled, and my neck felt stiff. I considered going down to the lobby to find the receptionist, but what would I say? That my lamp turned off by itself? That a vase moved a few inches on its own? I paced the room instead, trying to clear my thoughts. Eventually, I turned the lamp down to a low setting and tried to lie down. At around midnight, I heard a soft scuffling sound in the corridor. My pulse hammered again. I got out of bed, tiptoed to the door, and pressed my eye to the peephole. The hallway was too dim to see much. I thought I glimpsed a faint movement to the left, near the elevator. I waited, breath held, but saw nothing else. My chest felt tight. I pulled away from the peephole and backed up. A wave of adrenaline coursed through me. I didn't want to open the door. I crawled back into bed, my eyes on the door the entire time. I felt powerless in that moment, pinned by my own anxiety and the unknown nature of whatever was happening. The next morning, I woke to a dull ache in my neck. I realized I had slept in a tense position. I resolved to cut my trip short. The atmosphere of the hotel weighed on me. I got dressed and went downstairs to speak to the receptionist about checking out earlier than planned. He greeted me with a neutral expression, as always. I explained I needed to leave for personal reasons. He showed no surprise, just said he would finalize my bill. I went back upstairs to pack my things. The hallway felt no different in daylight. The same dim lights, the same hush. I passed the mirror and saw my reflection looking worn and tired. I avoided focusing on it for too long. Entering my room, I found the vase on the table turned sideways. My heart pounded. I had left it facing forward when I went downstairs. I stared at it for several seconds, a chill spreading across my skin. I didn't touch it this time. I grabbed my suitcase and started stuffing my clothes and items inside, my hands shaking with each movement. Once finished, I took a final look around. The bed was unmade. The small table lamp sat in its usual spot. The vase remained at an odd angle, as if mocking my attempts to rationalize. I didn't want to wait around for more strange occurrences. I left the room, my grip on the suitcase handle tight, and made my way to the elevator. Back in the lobby, I approached the counter. The receptionist handed me the receipt and a pen. His eyes flickered to my face as if he might ask a question, but he said nothing. I scrawled my signature. When I picked up my bag, he nodded once in a curt goodbye. I stepped outside into the crisp mountain air. My lungs filled with relief, though I couldn't shake the lingering tension in my muscles. I waited by the gravel driveway, watching the building's tall windows. They reflected the morning light, revealing no hint of the unsettling nights I had experienced. My ride arrived after a few minutes. I placed my suitcase in the trunk and got in. As we drove away, I glanced back at the hotel. It stood silent, as though it kept its own secrets behind those dark walls. I felt my shoulders ease only after we rounded a bend, losing sight of the place. My mind replayed the small moments, the knock in the night, the flickering hallway light, the vase moving. The fear I felt was real, but I had no proof of anything except my own reactions. I knew I wouldn't forget the tension in that old mountain hotel. Even though it never showed a direct threat, it managed to unsettle me in a way I couldn't fully articulate. My heart still pounded at the memory of those silent halls as we drove away into the open road. I moved into the old house expecting nothing more than creaking floors and outdated fixtures. The place had been on the market for a while, and I assumed it needed a bit of work. On my first day, I walked through every room, checking for any signs of leaks or damage. Everything looked normal, if a little bare and cold. The paint on the walls seemed faded, and the furniture that came with the house felt stiff. I noticed the atmosphere was slightly heavy, but I wrote that off as my nerves or the dust in the air. My first night there was uneventful. I set up a small cot in the largest bedroom and unpacked a few boxes of clothes and books. The tap in the bathroom dripped a bit, but that was the only real annoyance. I ate a quick meal from a can and tried to relax. The house was quiet, with the occasional settling noises that all old buildings make. I felt a mild sense of relief that nothing stood out as strange. The next morning, I decided to take photos of the interior for my personal records. I planned on sending them to a friend who was curious about my new place. I walked through each room, snapping pictures with my phone. The living room had a wide window facing a small yard. The dining area led into the kitchen, which looked a bit outdated with its old cabinets. The upstairs hallway was narrow, lined with closed doors. Nothing seemed unusual until I reviewed the photos on my phone later that afternoon. In a few of the pictures, I noticed small white orbs floating in the air. At first, I assumed it was just dust particles or lens flare. I zoomed in, expecting to see the typical shape that comes from reflected light. But these orbs looked slightly denser, almost cloudy, as if they had texture. Some were near the ceiling, others seemed to hover at eye level. I shrugged it off. Old houses are dusty. I set my phone aside and continued with my day. During that first week, I tried to make the house feel more like home. I brought in more furniture, installed better lighting, and cleaned every corner. As I dusted the living room, I felt a mild pressure in my ears, like the air was heavier than it should be. My shoulders tensed for no reason. I thought it might be the old ventilation system. When I switched on a small radio for background noise, the signal crackled, which I assumed was just poor reception. I took more pictures as I worked, wanting to see before and after shots of each room. Again, I noticed the same orb-like shapes in some photos. They varied in size, with some about the diameter of a coin and others bigger than my palm. They appeared in the hallway, the upstairs bedroom, and once in the kitchen near the sink. Whenever I looked at them, I felt a slight chill on my arms, but I dismissed it as me standing in a drafty hallway for too long. A few days later, I invited a friend over. She considered herself sensitive to energies or auras, though I was never sure how much of that I believed. While we walked through the house, she paused in the living room and frowned. She said the air felt thick, like a quiet pressure against her chest. I noticed she kept looking at a corner where the wall met the ceiling. She didn't elaborate, so I moved on to show her the rest of the place. In the upstairs hallway, she mentioned she felt a slight tingle in her arms. I felt uneasy hearing her say that because I had experienced something similar when I first moved in. Still, we both tried to keep the tone light. Later, we reviewed the new photos I had taken that day. The orbs were there again, clearly visible on the phone screen, bobbing in various spots. My friend looked uneasy, but tried to stay calm. She mentioned that sometimes these orbs appear in pictures of places with lingering energies. I joked that maybe my house had extra curious dust. Inside, I felt a twist in my stomach. At night, I began to sense faint murmurs from time to time. They were never loud or clear. It felt like soft voices talking just beyond the range of full comprehension. I checked outside to see if neighbors were playing music or if the wind carried distant sounds. I found no source. My heart would beat faster, and I felt a dryness in my mouth whenever I listened too closely. The sounds faded whenever I tried to pinpoint them. One evening, I decided to head upstairs with a small handheld recorder, thinking I might catch an explanation. I placed the device on the hallway table, pressed record, and walked around for a while, just waiting. The corridor felt slightly cooler than the rest of the house. My arms prickled with goosebumps. After half an hour, I retrieved the recorder and played it back. Mostly, it captured my footsteps and the sound of me shifting my weight. At one point, though, there was a faint static hiss that lasted a couple of seconds. Nothing definitive, but it made my pulse spike. On the weekend, I contacted a small group of local enthusiasts who investigated unexplained occurrences. They arrived with equipment like EMF meters, temperature gauges, and cameras. While part of me felt silly allowing strangers to poke around my house, I also wanted some answers, or at least reassurance. They began in the living room, scanning the walls and corners with their instruments. One meter beeped softly when placed near an old armchair. Another device showed slight temperature fluctuations in the hallway. They took photos, and again the orbs appeared in several shots, drifting around the furniture. During their visit, 2 cameras drained their batteries unusually fast, even though they had been fully charged. One of the investigators said that electronics sometimes act strangely in certain environments, but he couldn't give me a firm explanation. My skin felt clammy. I was aware of my own tension, and I noticed the investigators looked unsettled as well, though they tried to remain calm. After a few hours, they packed up. Their conclusion was that they had documented anomalous readings, but nothing that pointed to a clear cause. Nighttime became more stressful for me after their visit. I began hearing soft taps on the walls. My bed sometimes felt like it shifted slightly, as if someone had sat on the edge, but I never saw any disturbance. My heart would race, and my breathing turned shallow when these things happened. Yet there was no damage, no voices telling me to leave, none of the dramatic signs you hear about in horror stories. The fear was in the subtlety, the sense that something was watching. I decided to contact someone who specialized in cleansing or balancing living spaces. I was not entirely convinced it would help, but I needed a change. A woman arrived one afternoon with a few small tools and a quiet demeanor. She walked through each room, humming softly, and burned a mild incense. She whispered phrases I couldn't fully understand. When she finished, she told me she had attempted to calm the energies. I thanked her, though I felt a mix of skepticism and hope. Surprisingly, over the next week, the phenomena seemed to lessen. The orbs showed up less frequently in the photos I took. The soft tapping on the walls grew infrequent. My mood improved, and I felt a bit more relaxed. I thought maybe it was a coincidence. Still, I welcomed the peace. But a few days later, I woke up in the middle of the night to a dull murmur in the hallway, like someone speaking softly. My chest tightened. I lay still, trying to make sense of the noise. The hush persisted for a minute or two, then faded. By the time I gathered the courage to investigate, the hall was silent. My arms felt cold. I realized the house wasn't entirely back to normal. Over time, though, these events dropped to a level I could tolerate. I started taking fewer pictures, partly because I didn't want to see if the orbs were back. I focused on repainting walls, rearranging furniture, and making the place feel more like mine. Whenever I sensed that slight pressure in the air, I would open a window, letting in some fresh breeze. I made sure to keep the house well lit at night, which helped my nerves. Occasionally, I could still hear a faint voice or a muffled knock, but I tried to ignore it. If I caught a glimpse of an orb in a photo, I avoided staring too long. I told myself that old houses have quirks and leftover traces of past occupants. As long as nothing physically threatened me, I could find a way to coexist. One evening, I had a conversation with a neighbor who'd lived down the street for years. She mentioned the house had a bit of a reputation. Previous residents never stayed more than a few years, but no one reported anything too disturbing. It was always minor noises, odd movements of items, and strange images in photographs. When she asked if I was experiencing anything similar, I told her I sometimes felt the place was drafty. I saw no reason to share all the details. I learned to keep my guard up after dark. If I heard creaks or subtle taps, I reminded myself that the house's structure was old. If the lights flickered, I blamed the outdated wiring. My stomach would still tighten at times, and my palms got sweaty when I thought I saw a shifting shape in my peripheral vision. But I never witnessed anything blatantly aggressive. The lingering sense was that I was not alone, but that presence didn't seem eager to harm me. After several months, the tension became a background hum in my life. Friends occasionally visited, and some mentioned feeling uneasy, but no one left in a panic. I kept the house clean, well lit, and rearranged furniture to improve airflow and layout. The sense of weight in the living room lessened as I changed the decor and placed more comfortable seating. My nights still held the risk of hearing a soft murmur or a light knock, but I found that playing soft music helped me sleep. I never got a definitive explanation. The investigators' data remained inconclusive, and the cleansing only provided temporary relief. Perhaps the orbs were just a visual manifestation of dust or humidity interacting with my camera's flash. Perhaps my own anxiety made me hyper-aware of normal house sounds. Yet some part of me felt the house had a hidden layer, like it held memories that drifted and brushed against my day-to-day life. In time, I stopped trying to chase the mystery. I accepted the house as it was. I learned to live with the occasional glimpses of orbs on my phone and the quiet feeling that someone was watching me from the corners. It might have been my own imagination, fueled by the odd occurrences, or it might have been something else. Either way, I kept my routine. I lived there, paid my bills, invited friends, and tried to let life move on normally. If anyone asks about that house now, I tell them it's a comfortable place, a bit out of the ordinary, but not harmful. I don't dwell on the orbs, the muffled voices, or the nights I woke up with chills. I continue to adjust lamps and furniture, hoping the environment becomes more welcoming. The tension still exists, but it's become a quiet, steady hum rather than an overwhelming fear. I suppose I learned that real unease doesn't need to be dramatic or loud. It can be quiet and persistent, a presence at the edges of your life, reminding you that some things remain unexplained. And if you can learn to live with that, life continues, even in an old house that leaves strange marks on your photographs. I moved into the old row house on a quiet street, hoping for a calm place to focus on my studies. The building was unremarkable from the outside, just a simple facade with a front door and 2 tall windows on either side. The real estate agent said the place had no unusual history. I wanted to believe her, so I signed the lease without hesitation. I liked the creaky wooden floors and the wide staircase leading up to the second floor. I also liked the idea of having a space to myself, away from the noise of the city center. On my first day, I carried in boxes of books and some basic furniture. The living room, kitchen, and bathroom were on the ground floor, while 2 bedrooms and a small office were upstairs. The corridor upstairs was slightly narrow, with an old yellowish lamp hanging from the ceiling. Each time I stepped on a certain floorboard, it groaned. I assumed that was normal wear and tear. That evening, I took a break from unpacking and sat in the living room, sipping tea. The house was quiet, with only the occasional pop of the old wooden beams. I glanced at the staircase, feeling a slight tug of unease, but I brushed it off. My day had been tiring, and I figured I was just edgy from moving in. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine. I spent my mornings organizing books and my afternoons working on a research project. I used the upstairs office as a study area, placing my desk near a window that overlooked a small yard. The corridor leading to this office was short, with 1 door on the left for a bedroom and another door on the right for a second bedroom. At the end of the corridor was a small attic entrance, closed by a hatch. The old lamp overhead provided a weak glow, casting faint shadows on the walls. One afternoon, as I walked upstairs to grab a book, I paused on the landing. I had the distinct impression that someone was at the end of the corridor, just beyond my field of vision. My heart gave a quick thump. I looked straight ahead and saw only the closed attic hatch and some shadowy corners. I shrugged and kept going, telling myself that I was spooked by the dim lighting. A couple of nights later, I was reading in bed when I heard a soft scraping noise above me. The sound lasted a few seconds, like a chair being dragged on a rough floor. The attic was right above my bedroom. I checked the time, just past midnight. My stomach tensed. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and headed into the corridor. The boards creaked under my feet. I stared at the attic hatch, feeling my throat tighten. I considered pushing it open to check, but the idea made my pulse race. Instead, I tapped the attic door lightly with the end of the flashlight. The scraping sound did not repeat. I returned to my room, heart still pounding. and told myself it was just an old house shifting in the night. Over the following week, I noticed an odd sensation whenever I passed through the upstairs corridor at dusk. I felt a subtle pressure on my shoulders, like being watched. Sometimes, I caught myself walking faster than usual, just to reach my office or bedroom quickly. The floorboard near the middle of the corridor let out its usual groan, but it sounded louder in the evening. I kept the light turned on in the corridor most of the time, hoping that the brightness would dispel the sense of unease. One evening, around dinner time, I heard a distinct thump in the corridor while I was downstairs. I froze, a spoon in my hand above a pot of soup. It wasn't the sound of creaking wood. It was more like someone's footstep on the floor. I set down the spoon and listened. A few seconds later, another thump. My skin prickled. I walked to the bottom of the stairs and called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded weak in the silence. No answer. I decided to investigate, taking slow steps upward. My heart hammered in my chest. When I reached the top, the corridor looked empty. The doors to the bedrooms were both closed, and the attic hatch was undisturbed. I inhaled shakily and reminded myself that old houses can make random sounds. I went back down, but my appetite was gone. Over time, I started to believe the corridor might hold more than just normal creaks. One night, I was heading to bed when I felt a sudden drop in temperature near the bedroom door. My arms broke out in goosebumps, and my breath came out in a ragged exhale. The corridor lamp flickered once, but then stayed lit. I stood there, my back to the stair railing, half expecting someone to appear behind me. Nothing happened, but I couldn't shake the sense that I was not alone. Eventually, I told a friend about my unease. She suggested I get the wiring checked or see if there was any structural damage. I called an electrician who examined the fuse box and the overhead lamp in the corridor. He found nothing unusual, just older wiring. He replaced a few connections and left. That night, the corridor still felt tense, as though the air was heavier there. I noticed that most of the unsettling moments happened at the same time of day, late evening or just after midnight. A mild draft seemed to run through the corridor around those hours, sometimes making the lamp sway slightly. One evening, I decided to watch from the top of the stairs for a few minutes, trying to see if the corridor shifted in the breeze. I saw nothing out of the ordinary, but I felt uneasy the entire time. My palms were sweaty, and I kept swallowing to clear my dry throat. A few days later, I woke up at about 3 a.m. to use the bathroom. As I stepped into the corridor, I felt my skin bristle with goosebumps. The lamp was off, and the moonlight from a bedroom window provided minimal illumination. I stood still, letting my eyes adjust. The corridor looked darker than usual. My mind raced with thoughts of what I might see if I turned the lamp on. My heart pounded, and my breath felt shallow. I flicked the switch. The corridor lamp blinked once, then lit up. I glanced around. Nothing moved. I rushed to the bathroom, did what I needed, and hurried back to bed, my pulse thudding in my ears. Not long after, I started hearing soft, whisper-like sounds when I walked to the office at night. They were too faint to understand, more like an airy murmur. I'd stop in the corridor, listening with my heart pounding, but I couldn't determine the source. My mind conjured images of someone standing just around the corner, waiting. I tried turning on music or podcasts to distract myself, but the sense of being watched persisted. I decided to try a small experiment. I placed a camera on a shelf in the corridor one evening, pointing it toward the attic hatch and the hallway. I left it recording while I worked in my office. After a few hours, I retrieved the camera and reviewed the footage. The corridor remained still, mostly silent. There were a few moments when the camera's microphone picked up soft sounds, like clicks or tiny taps, but nothing definite. I exhaled slowly, half relieved and half frustrated. Still, the raw fear I felt while walking there at night was real, even if the camera showed nothing. One night, I forced myself to confront my fear. I stood in the corridor with the main light on, waiting for maybe 10 minutes. I wanted to see if I could sense anything tangible. The silence pressed in. My back grew stiff, and my breathing became shallow. I felt a swirl of tension in my stomach. At one point, the corridor lamp seemed to dim for a fraction of a second, then returned to full brightness. My heart jumped, but I stayed in place. Nothing else happened, so I eventually went to bed, exhausted by my own anxiety. Despite these events, I couldn't pinpoint a single physical cause. I never found footprints or evidence of someone else entering my house. The attic hatch never appeared tampered with, and the electrician had ruled out major wiring issues. My fear built from small occurrences. That extra footstep, the drop in temperature, the flicker of the light, the whisper-like sounds, and the feeling that a presence stood just behind me or around the corner. After a couple of months, I adapted a bit. I tried not to linger in the corridor. I kept the doors open during the day, letting more light into that space, and I placed a bright lamp at each end. While the tension never fully vanished, the increased brightness gave me a sense of control. Sometimes I still heard a random thump or felt the hair on my arms rise, but I told myself that if nothing worse happened, I could handle it. One afternoon, a neighbor dropped by to introduce herself. She mentioned she'd known the previous owner, who had moved out abruptly. I asked if there was anything special about the house, but she just shook her head, saying the old occupant never complained about anything specific. This left me with more questions than answers. My neighbor noticed my anxious face and offered to help if I ever felt unsafe. I thanked her, though I didn't know how she could help with a problem I couldn't even define. Eventually, life continued. I used my office regularly, wrote my papers, and tried to ignore the corridor's unsettling vibe. Some nights were calmer than others. On the rough nights, I'd keep the bedroom door shut, my heart pounding at each creak in the hallway. I had no evidence of an intruder, no real proof that something supernatural roamed there. Still, the raw discomfort stuck around, nagging at me. When people ask how I like the house, I say it's mostly fine, just old and creaky. I don't talk about the sense of being watched or the fleeting images I sometimes catch in my peripheral vision. I don't mention how I occasionally pause at the bottom of the stairs, unwilling to climb into that corridor after sunset. Part of me still hopes it's all in my head. Yet I remember the evenings when I stood in the dim hallway, lamp overhead casting those long shadows, feeling every beat of my pulse as I waited for a silent shape to reveal itself. The shape never came, but the fear stayed. Even now, if I approach that corridor at night, I brace myself for the possibility that I'll see a darker patch in the corner, or sense a presence drifting along the walls. I learned that the worst dread sometimes comes from the smallest signs: a creaking board, a flickering bulb, a faint breath of air. Those moments remind me that despite the house looking ordinary, the corridor holds a quiet power that keeps me on edge. And so I live here, balancing my normal routines with a subtle, constant awareness that something in that corridor does not want me to feel entirely at ease. I first realized something was wrong when the road seemed to repeat itself. I had been driving for almost an hour on a rural highway, heading toward a small house where I intended to spend a few quiet days. The sun was low, and the sky had a soft orange hue. The air felt still. My plan was simple: drive another 20 or 30 minutes, arrive before dark, and settle in for a peaceful evening. Yet, As I passed a certain stretch of fence and a row of trees for what felt like the second time, my gut tightened with unease. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, expecting to see maybe 5:30 p.m. Instead, it showed 5:10 p.m., 10 minutes earlier than I thought it should be. I told myself I must have made an error in reading the time. I adjusted my seat, checked the rearview mirror, and tried to concentrate on the lines of the road. The fence and trees appeared again. My mouth went dry. I checked the clock once more. It was still 5:10 p.m. A chill moved through my arms, and my grip on the steering wheel tightened. The road was mostly empty, with occasional fields and small hills rolling in the distance. I spotted no cars ahead or behind. I inhaled slowly, trying to steady my nerves. Maybe I was just tired. After another few minutes, the situation got stranger. The sun in the sky had not shifted, and the clock on the dashboard barely moved. It read 5:11 p.m. I rubbed my eyes, blinked hard, and looked at my phone to compare. My phone displayed 6:24 p.m. My heart thumped fast. It made no sense. How could the dashboard clock be so far off compared to my phone's clock? I rechecked the phone's settings. Everything seemed normal. My hands began to sweat and my chest felt tight. I decided to pull over to the side of the road. The engine ticked softly as I turned it off. The evening air felt cool when I opened the door. I walked a few steps onto the grass, looking around for any signs of life. A farmhouse, a passing car, something to confirm that I wasn't alone in this odd moment. The land stretched out, empty. The only sounds I heard were my own footsteps and my heartbeat thrumming in my ears. I pulled out my phone again. Still 6:24 p.m. The sky suggested it was close to sunset, which fit the phone's time. The car's dashboard clock suggested an hour earlier. I shook my head and got back in the vehicle, telling myself I'd ignore the car's clock and trust my phone. I drove again, determined to find the small house before full dark. The road kept going in a straight line, with sparse trees and fences on each side. After a few miles, I noticed a wooden sign stating the town's name. It looked old, half covered by vines. I passed it and kept going for another 10 or 15 minutes. Then, to my shock, I saw the same sign again, as if I had looped in a circle. My body tensed. I pressed my foot against the brake, slowing down. Had I made a wrong turn? The highway had no major intersections, just occasional dirt roads branching off. I didn't recall turning onto any of them. My chest felt tight, and my pulse drummed in my temples. I pulled over again, confusion churning in my stomach. My phone now read 6:45 p.m. The sun was definitely lower. The car's clock, however, showed 5:15 p.m. I exhaled through gritted teeth. This was not normal. I checked my GPS app, but it showed weak service and kept trying to reroute me in strange patterns. I decided to drive back in the direction I had come from, hoping to find a landmark or a gas station. I turned the car around, my arms tense on the wheel. My shoulders ached from the stress of it all. For a while, the scenery looked different, which gave me hope that I was making progress. I spotted a small cluster of trees, a broken gate, and a gravel pull-off. Then, without warning, I found myself passing the same wooden sign from before, but coming from the opposite side. My stomach dropped, and a wave of dread swept over me. I slammed on the brakes. The car lurched to a stop. I sat there, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of the situation. The clock on the dashboard read 5:20 p.m. I closed my eyes, counted to 10, and opened them again. No change. My phone now read 7:10 p.m., and the sky was growing darker. The logic of it all unraveled in my mind. I was losing track of reality. My throat felt dry, and my heart pounded so hard that I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Sweat beaded on my forehead. I needed to calm down and figure out my next step. Going forward or backward didn't seem to matter. The road was playing tricks on me, or I was playing tricks on myself. Either way, I had to keep moving. I decided to drive slowly and watch for side roads or anything that might lead me out of this endless loop. The headlights cut through the dusk as the sun vanished. The farmland around me faded into silhouettes. I rolled down the window to let in some cool air. The wind felt steady, with no unusual chill. Occasionally, I heard the distant call of some night bird. Time dragged on. The phone's clock showed 7:30 p.m., 7:45 p.m., 8 p.m., while the car's clock inched forward from 5:20 to 5:21 to 5:22 over the same span. Eventually, I spotted a sign indicating a small intersection leading to a country lane. Desperate for any change, I turned onto it. The lane was rough, with potholes. I followed it for a while, the headlights revealing patches of grass and gravel. After several minutes, I found a small cabin-like structure. Its windows were dark. I parked and stepped out, my legs unsteady. A wooden porch creaked under my weight as I approached the door. I knocked, quietly at first, then louder. No response. I tried the door. It was locked. I peered through a window. It looked like a basic interior with a table and some chairs, but no sign of recent activity. My phone still showed 8:15 p.m., though the sky looked more like deep twilight than full night. The car's clock read 5:24 p.m. I felt lightheaded. I considered breaking into the cabin just for a place to regroup, but the idea made my stomach churn. Instead, I returned to the car. I realized I was nearly out of gas. My gauge hovered near empty. I had not planned on driving in circles for hours. I kept driving along that lane, hoping it would reconnect with a main road. The route twisted through pockets of trees. At times, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights behind me, or maybe a figure on the side of the road. Each time, there was nothing but darkness and the faint outline of branches. My chest felt heavy, and my breaths grew shallow. Finally, the lane fed back into a bigger highway, though I couldn't tell if it was the same one I had started on. By now, the phone read 9 p.m. The sky was full night, yet some part of me expected it should have been even darker. I drove on, searching for a sign or anything that might indicate how to reach the house I had rented. I saw no streetlights, no other cars, and no signs of life. A dull fear settled in my mind, like I was stuck in a pocket of reality that refused to line up with normal time. Suddenly, I noticed the faint glow of lights on the horizon. I accelerated, hope rising inside me. As I approached, I realized it was a small cluster of buildings, a diner and a gas station. Relief washed through me. I pulled into the station, noticing a single overhead lamp illuminating a pair of pumps. The diner next door looked closed, its windows dark. I parked at a pump and killed the engine. My phone read 9:30 p.m., yet the station's overhead clock by the door displayed 11:05 p.m. Another mismatch. I swallowed hard, stepped out, and tried my credit card at the pump. It worked, which was a surprise at this point. I pumped gas, glancing around to see if anyone was inside the station office. I saw no one. The door was locked. My reflection in the glass stared back at me, eyes wide with worry. The interior lights were off. I got back in my car, my hands shaking as I turned the key. This time the engine coughed and started normally, but the dashboard clock now showed 5:30 p.m. I let out a ragged sigh. I checked my phone, 9:35 p.m. Realizing there was nothing else I could do, I drove on, following the single road that curved away from the gas station. After about 15 minutes, I spotted a sign for the address I was aiming for. My spirits lifted slightly. I took a right turn onto a smaller road, past a few unlit mailboxes, and finally saw a mailbox bearing the number from my rental confirmation. The house itself was a short distance down a gravel driveway. I pulled up, parked, and sat there for a moment to catch my breath. The windows of the house were dark, but a porch light was on, casting a pale circle on the door. I looked at my phone. 9:55 p.m. The car's clock. 5:35 p.m. I grabbed my bag and approached the front door. I had a key from the rental owner. With trembling hands, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The interior smelled stale, like it had been closed up for a while. I located a light switch near the entrance. The bulbs flickered to life, revealing a small living room with a worn couch and a coffee table. I exhaled, feeling a sense of shaky relief. At least I had arrived somewhere tangible. Inside, I found a wall clock that indicated 2 a.m. My stomach flipped again. Different times everywhere I looked. I realized I was exhausted. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and dropped onto the couch. My phone still showed 9:55 p.m., though outside it looked more like near midnight. I tried calling a friend, but the call didn't connect. The signal was too weak. My heart still raced, and I felt disconnected from any normal sense of time. When I woke the next morning, I saw sunlight streaming through the windows. My phone showed 7 a.m. The wall clock in the living room, though, read 3:15 p.m. The car's clock was out of sight in the driveway, but I doubted it would show anything consistent. I stepped outside, noticing the bright morning sky and the cool air that felt appropriate for early day. My shoulders eased as I took a deep breath. Maybe I had dreamt the entire ordeal, but the tension in my back and the images of that repeating road loop were too vivid to be a dream. Over the next few days, I tried to keep track of time using my phone, which seemed to sync with actual day and night patterns. Still, I couldn't explain the lost hours on the road or the different clocks. Sometimes, when I walked around the small property, I felt a lingering unease, like the air might shift and throw me back into that endless loop. My mind replayed the images of that highway sign and the weird mismatch of times. I never felt fully settled, even though I didn't experience any more obvious time distortions while staying in that house. When I finally left to head home, I took a different route, a main highway that led toward a busier town. The drive was uneventful. My phone's time matched the sun's position, and the road signs progressed logically. Yet I kept glancing at the clock on the dashboard, which remained frozen at 5:40 p.m. No matter what I did, it refused to change. That final detail left me with a dull sense of dread. I couldn't dismiss what had happened. I told a few people about the experience, and they offered rational explanations. Maybe I was tired, maybe I made a wrong turn and panicked, maybe the car's clock broke. But no one could explain how I passed the same sign multiple times, or why the phone's time and the house clocks were so out of sync. Even now, when I recall that strange night, my heart speeds up. I can feel the steering wheel in my hands, the quiet tension in the empty fields, and the creeping sense that I was caught in a place where time bent in on itself. I returned the rental house key soon after. I made no mention of the bizarre drive. The owner just thanked me politely. I still sometimes wonder if I had stumbled into an area where time was unstable, or if I had experienced a personal glitch in my perception. Regardless, I can't forget that stretch of highway or the eerie loop that defied everything I understood about travel. The memory clings to me, even though normal life continues. And whenever I look at a clock, I pause for a moment, checking to see if it still aligns with the rest of the world, or if it's about to spin me back into a reality I can't explain. stepped out of the little sandwich shop that afternoon, holding a bright sign announcing our new promotion. The day was calm, with a warm sun overhead and not much traffic on the street. My boss had told me to stand out by the curb and wave the sign around to catch the attention of anyone passing by. I expected nothing more than the usual routine: stand there, maybe nod or wave when people looked, and then head back inside for my shift. But something felt slightly off. I couldn't pinpoint why. The sky was clear, the temperature pleasant, yet I had this odd flutter in my stomach. I shook that feeling off, thinking I was just nervous about looking silly with the sign. I positioned myself on the sidewalk, glanced around for any pedestrians, and started lifting the sign so drivers could read it. There were a few cars passing slowly, maybe on their way home from work or picking up groceries. Occasionally, someone glanced at me, but no one stopped. About half an hour in, a sense of unease crept up on me. My heartbeat felt stronger, and my palms started to sweat. The sign wasn't heavy, but I switched arms anyway, wondering why I felt tense. Nothing unusual was happening around me. The shop behind me was quiet because it was a slow day. The sidewalk was almost empty. I could hear the faint hum of a car engine now and then, along with a gentle breeze rustling leaves in the distance. Suddenly, a vivid image flashed in my head. It felt like a memory, except it hadn't happened yet. I saw a car speeding, swerving out of control, hopping onto the curb exactly where I was standing. The vision struck me so fast that my stomach clenched. My heart hammered against my chest. I looked up and down the street. No car was in sight, and traffic remained light. Still, my instincts screamed at me to move. I couldn't explain it, but I took 3 or 4 steps back, away from the curb. A second or two later, I heard the screech of tires. My head whipped around in time to see a car suddenly veer to the side of the road. It slid halfway onto the sidewalk, almost exactly where I had been standing. The vehicle didn't crash at full speed. Maybe the driver managed to brake in time, or maybe luck intervened. Still, it hit the curb with a dull thud. My chest felt like it was about to burst. For a frozen moment, I just stared, wide-eyed. The driver was hunched over the steering wheel, eyes wide with shock. The car's front tire flattened on impact with the curb, and a corner of the bumper scraped the concrete. Bits of debris clattered across the pavement. I realized my mouth was hanging open. My hands shook, and the sign wobbled in my grip. I forced myself to breathe. The driver looked dazed but not hurt. I took a step forward to see if he needed help. A couple of people from down the street jogged over to check on the situation. The driver eventually got out, trembling slightly, but able to stand. He apologized to everyone around, clearly rattled. He said he lost control for a second, maybe because he was distracted or had a mechanical issue. I backed up, trying to stay out of the small crowd forming. My heart wouldn't stop pounding. No one was seriously injured, and the damage to the car wasn't severe. It was more of a shock than a full-blown accident. Still, my mind reeled at the closeness of it all. If I hadn't moved, the front of that car might have clipped me. I could have been pinned. I felt a surge of dizziness, my vision wobbling for a moment. I closed my eyes, inhaled deeply, then exhaled. I realized my arms were stiff, still holding the promotion sign. A police car eventually arrived. The officer took some statements. Most people said they saw the car swerve but didn't know why. The driver insisted his brakes malfunctioned. The officer asked me if I was okay and if I'd seen everything. I explained I had jumped aside at the last second because I sensed something was off. I didn't mention the vivid image or how I felt pushed to move. That sounded too bizarre. The officer jotted down notes, nodded, and told me he'd pass my information along if needed. Once the situation calmed, the crowd dispersed. The driver called a tow truck. I stood there, still shaking, unsure what to do. My boss came out, alarmed by the commotion. I told him everything was under control and that I was fine. He looked pale, but relieved. He told me to come inside and sit down. I followed him back into the sandwich shop, still gripping the sign. I hadn't even realized I was holding it that tightly. Inside, the fluorescent lights felt glaring. I sat at one of the tables, my knees jittery. My boss brought me a glass of water and told me to take my time. He asked me to explain more, but I didn't have a clear explanation. I could only say that I felt an overpowering instinct that made me move away from the curb. My voice shook as I recounted how the car jumped onto the sidewalk. My boss patted my shoulder, eyes wide. He asked if I needed to go home for the day. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, but another part of me was still in shock, unable to decide. After a moment, I said I would take a short break and see how I felt. I rested in the back of the shop for about 20 minutes, trying to steady my breathing. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of that car riding up the curb flashed through my mind. The memory of that strong pull to step back filled my thoughts. My hands felt clammy and my stomach churned. A wave of relief also washed over me each time I realized I was safe. It was a chaotic blend of fear and gratitude. Eventually, I returned to the dining area. My boss said the street was calm again and the police had left. He gently suggested I forget about standing outside with the sign for the rest of the day. I nodded. I figured the promotion wasn't worth the risk, and I doubted I could concentrate on it anyway. Instead, I tried to refocus on normal shop tasks, refilling napkin dispensers, wiping tables, and helping customers. It was a slow afternoon, so I had plenty of time to process what had happened. I noticed I was jumpy whenever I heard a car door slam or an engine rev outside. My chest would tighten, and I'd pause in mid-action. A couple of customers asked if I was okay because they saw me flinch at small noises. I forced a smile and said I was just tired. My mind churned with questions. Why did I get that flash, that sudden warning in my head? Was it just a coincidence? Did I notice something subtle, like the sound of screeching tires, before the actual accident? Or was there something else at work? After my shift, I stayed behind to talk to my boss. He told me to head home and rest, but I found myself wanting to describe the experience more clearly. He listened with patience. I told him about the split-second vision of the car losing control. He looked puzzled, not skeptical. He could see I was shaken. He said maybe I saw the driver speeding and, subconsciously, realized something was wrong before my conscious mind picked it up. It was as good an explanation as any, though it still felt surreal. That night, I lay in bed replaying the event. My arms felt tense at the memory. My heart picked up speed whenever I pictured the car barreling onto the sidewalk. Over and over, I saw how close it was, how easily I could have been hurt. My chest tightened at the thought of that near miss. It felt impossible to shake off. I tried to distract myself with my phone, scrolling through random videos, but my mind kept drifting back to that moment. The sense of a near disaster I barely avoided pressed down on me. In the days that followed, I returned to work, but avoided holding that sign on the sidewalk. My boss didn't push me to do it. He just said we'd find other ways to advertise. For a while, every time I stepped outside the shop, I felt a wave of apprehension. My eyes darted to the spot where the car had jumped the curb. The scuff marks on the concrete were a reminder. I also found myself scanning every passing vehicle for signs of trouble. Were they slowing in time? Did the drivers seem distracted? I realized my senses were on high alert. which left me exhausted by the end of each day. Other employees asked me about it. I told them I was just shaken up, but that I was trying to move on. They nodded, sympathetic. A couple of them were grateful I hadn't been hurt. They said the car could have caused real harm if it hit me at full speed. I agreed, still puzzled by the sudden push to step back. None of us had a real explanation. Life carried on, with customers coming and going, and eventually, people stopped talking about the incident. I never fully dismissed the strangeness, though. I'd catch myself thinking about it randomly, remembering that flash of a future that didn't quite happen. My stomach would tighten all over again. Each time, I felt an odd mixture of awe and fear at how close things came to being far worse. Part of me wondered if that moment changed me, making me more aware of sudden dangers. Another part of me wanted to block it out and keep living normally. A few weeks later, I walked by that corner again, looking at the concrete where the car had bumped it. The scuff marks were less visible, maybe washed away by rain. The street seemed calm, just as it had the day of the accident. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and went back inside the shop to start my shift. I told myself that unpredictability is part of life, that sometimes we notice signs, or sometimes we just get lucky. I still couldn't decide which category my experience fell into. Even now, when someone mentions close calls or sudden feelings, I think about that afternoon in front of the sandwich shop. I recall the bright sign in my hands, the nerves that turned into a full-body jolt, and the final moment when I stepped aside just in time. My heart always beats a little faster at the memory. I keep it to myself most of the time, though. People might not believe it, or they might think it's just hindsight. But I remember how my breath caught in my throat and how real that vision felt. I remember how the scorching rush of fear melted into relief as I stood there, unscathed, while the driver stared at me with wide eyes. I learned that sometimes our bodies or minds pick up warnings we can't explain. Maybe it was all coincidence, maybe not. Either way, I can't forget the chill that swept through me or the gratitude I felt for those few steps backward. Now, whenever I'm out near a busy street, I keep an extra watch on my surroundings, ready to move in case I sense that same urgent pull. And I never hold that shop's sign at the corner without being fully aware of every car approaching, no matter how slow they seem. I started my new night shift at an old, somewhat isolated hotel, expecting quiet evenings with minimal tasks. The manager walked me through my responsibilities: handle late check-ins, answer the phone, and keep an eye on the security monitors. He pointed out that the hotel had 2 levels of parking, one on the ground floor and one above, accessible by an aging elevator near the back of the building. He mentioned that I should check the upper parking level a couple of times each night to ensure no one wandered up there by accident. On my first night, I settled in behind the reception desk, half watching the front doors and half watching the dimly lit lobby. The place looked old, with polished wood panels and faded rugs that muffled footsteps. The decorative lamps gave off a soft glow, casting more shadows than I liked. I noticed a mirror on the far wall reflecting part of the lobby, which felt oddly distracting whenever I glanced at it. Everything else felt normal, though, just a standard night shift in a quiet hotel. A few hours in, around 11 p.m., I decided to do my first walkthrough. I locked the main doors, standard procedure since the lobby was officially closed to the public, then took the old service elevator up to the upper parking level. The elevator rattled and hummed. My pulse quickened slightly, but I told myself it was just the building's age and the lateness of the hour. When I reached the top, the elevator doors opened onto a wide concrete floor marked with yellow lines for parking spaces. I stepped out, shining a flashlight around. The overhead lights weren't very bright, leaving large areas in shadow. A slight breeze moved through the space, possibly from vents or open panels near the ceiling. I walked up and down the rows of empty parking spots, hearing only my own footsteps echo off the concrete walls. Nothing looked out of place, just a few parked cars belonging to guests. I felt relieved and returned to the elevator, heading back to the lobby. Later that night, I was at the reception desk reviewing some paperwork. The security monitors, small, grainy screens, showed various angles of the corridors and parking levels. Everything looked still. Around midnight, I heard a faint metallic sound. I paused, heart rate climbing, trying to pinpoint the source. It had a hollow quality, like a piece of metal being tapped. I glanced at the monitors, saw no change, and waited. The sound faded. My shoulders remained tense, but I forced myself to calm down and resumed my paperwork. An hour later, I decided to do another check of the upper parking. The elevator ride felt slower this time, as if each floor dragged by. The fluorescent light inside the elevator flickered once, making my stomach lurch. I arrived at the top and stepped out again. The same mild breeze moved through the space. My flashlight beam revealed the same cars as before. I walked the perimeter, pausing whenever a mild creak or shifting echo reached my ears. Each time I heard nothing more, just the hum of the building's ventilation. Satisfied that no one was there, I returned to the elevator. When I got back to the lobby, the phone at the reception desk rang. My heart jumped. Calls at that hour were rare. I answered, greeting the caller. A guest on the third floor complained about a strange banging noise, but he couldn't tell if it was from a neighboring room or from somewhere above him. I apologized for the disturbance and said I'd check the floor. I took the main elevator up, walked the corridor, and listened. Everything was quiet except for the typical low hum of the air conditioning. I knocked on the guest's door gently, told him I'd found nothing, and he shrugged, looking embarrassed. He thanked me, and I went back downstairs. The next night I felt more at ease initially. I had a book to read, and the hours were passing without incident. Just after midnight, though, I heard the same metallic sound from the previous night. It lasted longer, a rhythmic tapping that stopped and started in intervals of a few seconds. I looked at the monitors. The small black and white feed for the upper parking area showed only static darkness. None of the cameras revealed movement. My mouth felt dry. I set the book down, took my flashlight, and headed for the service elevator. The ride up felt tense. I tried to keep my breathing steady. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped out onto the concrete floor again. My flashlight cut through the dimness, sweeping from left to right. No signs of people, no cars moving, just a dull echo of my own footsteps. I listened hard for the metallic noise, but heard only the distant hum of building machinery. After a slow circuit of the parking area, I returned to the elevator. Back at the desk, I checked the monitors again. One of the screens flickered briefly, showing a momentary spike of static. I leaned closer, trying to see if it was just a glitch or something else. It returned to normal. My heart still pounded, and I realized I was gripping the edge of the desk too tightly. I made myself take a few deep breaths. Over the following nights, I developed a pattern: check in with the manager, watch the monitors, walk through the building, ride the elevator to the upper parking level, and come back. Sometimes everything felt routine. Other times, I heard faint noises, scraping sounds, soft clicks, or a single clang of metal against concrete. I never found evidence of anyone lurking around. The tension built in my shoulders each time I realized I had no explanation. On one particular night, around 2 a.m., the security feed from the upper parking caught my eye. The camera angle showed a row of parked cars and part of the concrete wall. For a split second, I thought I saw a shape move between two vehicles, just a dark blur. My stomach flipped. I rewound the feed, but the system was too basic to replay in detail, and it only captured in short intervals. I couldn't confirm what I saw. My palms went clammy as I headed for the service elevator, determined to catch whoever might be there. The elevator door slid open on the top level, and I stepped out with my flashlight held tight. My heart thudded. I aimed the light between the parked cars where I'd seen movement on the screen. Nothing. My breath came in short bursts. I walked past each vehicle, checking the spaces in between. I found no one. The breeze brushed against the back of my neck, making me shiver. I spoke out loud, asking if anyone was there, my voice echoing on the concrete walls. No response. My body felt coiled like a spring, ready to jump at the slightest sound. I stayed up there longer than usual, determined not to rush back down in a panic. After a thorough check, I rode the elevator back to the lobby. The desk phone rang almost immediately. I picked it up with a shaky hand. It was a different guest, saying they heard footsteps outside their room on the second floor, but no one was there when they looked through the peephole. I apologized again, went up to check, and found nothing. As time passed, I grew convinced that something about the upper parking level was off. I never caught an intruder, never found evidence of tampering, but the noises and fleeting shapes on the monitor continued. I didn't feel threatened exactly, more unsettled, as though the space itself was aware of me. My coworkers dismissed my concerns, saying old buildings make weird noises and cameras can glitch. The manager just told me to keep doing my job and let him know if I found any real problem. One night, around 3 a.m., I tried a different approach. Instead of taking the service elevator, I accessed the upper parking level via an external stairwell at the side of the building. The stairs were narrow, and the overhead light flickered. My footsteps felt loud on the metal steps. When I reached the top, I pushed open a heavy door leading into the parking area. The moment I stepped inside, the door swung shut behind me with a clang that reverberated in the enclosed space. I almost dropped my flashlight. Taking a deep breath, I scanned the area. My flashlight beam landed on a trash can that had been knocked over, spilling a few crumpled papers onto the floor. I frowned, stepping closer. I had never seen that can tipped before. My heart pounded as I listened for signs of someone lurking behind the cars. Silence. I put the can upright, collected the scattered paper, and dropped it back in. The air felt heavier than usual, and I realized I was holding my breath. Suddenly, a quick metallic tap echoed from the opposite end of the parking area, near the elevator. I turned, flashlight trembling in my hand, but I couldn't see anything beyond the rows of cars. My breath caught in my throat. Another tap, slightly louder this time. I steeled myself and headed in that direction, each step echoing. By the time I reached the elevator, all was quiet again. My fingers felt cold around the flashlight. I called out, my voice uneven. Nothing moved. I pressed the elevator button, the doors opened, and I stepped inside, relieved to be leaving that floor. Back in the lobby, I sat at the desk, my heart still racing. The cameras revealed the same static images, no sign of anyone in the upper parking. Yet I couldn't deny the trash can had been knocked over, and the tapping had sounded real. I spent the rest of my shift in a tense state, jumping at every slight noise. Over the following weeks, the pattern continued. unexplained noises, minor anomalies, fleeting glimpses of movement on the monitors. I checked the parking level regularly and never caught anyone in the act of trespassing or causing damage. It became a constant background unease in my routine. My body reacted each time I rode the elevator up, muscles tight, breath shallow, expecting to find something new and unnerving. Nothing escalated to a real threat, but the relentless uncertainty wore me down. Eventually, I confided in the day staff about my experiences. Most of them laughed it off or said I was imagining things. One older co-worker hinted that similar reports had popped up years ago, with no explanations found. That comment stuck with me, making me feel less alone in my unease but no less afraid. I kept at the job, though each night I wondered if I'd regret returning. The manager rarely scheduled a second night staff person, so I faced the quiet hours alone, maintaining the front desk, answering the occasional phone call, and patrolling the shadowy upper parking level. Each time I heard a metallic tap or spotted a strange flicker on the security feed, my pulse surged. Each time, I found nothing solid to report. Eventually, I grew somewhat accustomed to it, though the tension never fully left. My shoulders remained tight, my senses heightened whenever I stepped onto that concrete floor under the dim lights. Some nights were calmer, with no odd sounds. Other nights, I found myself running the flashlight over every corner, sure I'd catch someone or something behind a parked car. Yet it was always just me and the faint echoes of my own presence. After several months, I decided to switch to a different job. The hotel manager thanked me for my service, never admitting the place had any particular issues. I turned in my key card and stepped out of that quiet lobby for the final time, a mix of relief and lingering tension in my chest. Even now, I sometimes dream about that upper parking level. In my dreams, I'm alone on the concrete floor, hearing that metallic tapping grow louder, but I can't find the source. I wake up with my heart pounding, reminded of those long nights of searching for an answer that never arrived. Everything shifted on a quiet afternoon in 1995. I was sitting on the front steps of the apartment building where I lived, trying to escape the heat. It was a small residential complex with plain walls, narrow hallways, and a courtyard that everyone used as a gathering spot. We all knew each other by first name, and daily life felt predictable. Around that time, our regular postman, a man named Carlos, stood out from the usual routine. He was cheerful in a genuine way. He smiled when he saw me. He made easy small talk with residents every time he delivered letters. He seemed to know everyone's schedule and would ask about children's birthdays or how a job search was going. I never thought his friendly demeanor would fade, but it did. The change happened bit by bit, and I noticed it more than most because I saw him nearly every afternoon. I remember the first sign of his shift. It was a Wednesday morning. He came through the front gate and barely nodded in my direction. He seemed preoccupied. I found it strange but assumed he was having a tough day. I even asked, "Everything good, Carlos?" He just said, "Yes," and walked inside the hallway to drop off the mail. Normally, he would have paused for a moment, maybe told me some story about a neighbor's dog or joked about the weather. That day, his voice was flat. His eyes looked blank, and I could sense he wanted to avoid conversation. At the time, I felt a little uneasy, but told myself people have bad days. The next morning, it was the same. He delivered the mail, said little, and refused to meet anyone's gaze. During the following days, I watched him greet others, or fail to greet them at all. Some people waved at him, expecting the usual cheerful hello. He responded with quick nods or short answers. His cheerful tone was gone, replaced by something distant. I also noticed how he would stop halfway down a corridor, holding a stack of envelopes, and stand there as if he were lost. He would stare at the door in front of him, not moving for a few seconds, then keep going. He also avoided the usual jokes and neighborly chit-chat. It was as if he was carrying a secret that weighed him down. I couldn't ignore the tension I felt whenever I saw him. My shoulders felt tight, and my pulse sped up a bit, like I was bracing myself for something strange to happen. I tried to talk to a neighbor named Lucia about it. She shrugged and said, "He's probably stressed. Maybe he's got problems at home." I agreed out loud, but privately I felt uneasy. Carlos's change went beyond everyday stress. His eyes looked empty. He appeared more and more distracted, and sometimes he wouldn't answer when someone thanked him for delivering their mail. One afternoon, I tried a friendly approach. I said, "Carlos, I haven't seen your usual smile in a while. How are you?" He forced a small grin, but didn't open his mouth. Then he walked away. That encounter left me feeling a dull pressure in my chest, like I'd walked into a space that wasn't meant for me. About a month passed before people realized his behavior was more than just a temporary mood. A few neighbors asked if I'd heard him speak more than a sentence. No one had. A man from downstairs, Marcos, said he saw Carlos standing at the stairwell, holding onto the railing, looking at the wall. He didn't even move when Marcos called his name. He just kept gripping the metal bar, breathing slowly. Then, without a word, he continued on his route. I felt a chill run down my back when I heard that story. It matched my own experiences, the silent stares, the hesitant posture. One hot day, he stopped showing up. Another postal worker delivered our mail for a week. Rumors spread quickly. Maybe he was sick. Maybe he quit. Then, on the 8th day, a sudden commotion broke out in front of our building. 3 or 4 police officers stood around, accompanied by a few reporters with cameras. People gathered in the courtyard and peered from their balconies. I left my apartment and walked down the steps to see what was happening. I saw the new postman off to the side, talking to a uniformed officer. I caught snippets of their conversation. They mentioned Carlos's name. They used words like psychological care and stress. I didn't understand everything, but I gathered Carlos had some kind of breakdown and needed immediate attention. I didn't see Carlos with them. I didn't see anyone carry him away. The police left after a while, and the reporters lost interest. The residents were left whispering about what could have happened to him. No one had answers, and I felt a knot in my stomach. I wanted to know more. I tried asking one of the officers, but he told me he couldn't share details. He said something about an incident near our building's basement area. My curiosity spiked. Our building had a small technical area in the basement where maintenance supplies and old equipment were stored. I hardly went down there except to throw out old boxes or check fuses. The officer's quick mention of that area made me think something was hidden there. That same day, I walked around that lower level. I shouldn't have, but I felt compelled to see if something was out of place. I checked the usual corners. I found nothing new near the fuse boxes. Then I noticed a small door that led into a narrow storage corridor. A sign hung overhead, warning that it was a staff area for building maintenance. It was usually locked, but that day it was open a crack. I pushed it gently and walked inside. The corridor was dimly lit by a single bulb that flickered. My heartbeat quickened when I saw the walls. They were covered with old newspaper clippings, yellowed notes, torn envelopes, and what looked like random scribbles in pencil or ink. My skin prickled, and I felt a cold drop of sweat trickle down my back. I checked the floor and saw more scattered papers. There were names scrawled on them, including the names of a few residents. Some had addresses from different parts of the city. There were also scribbles in a style I couldn't decipher. My hands felt clammy. I didn't know if I was intruding on something dangerous, but I kept looking. I saw a piece of paper pinned to the wall with the words, "Undelivered, return to sender." Next to it, I noticed a letter that had a red stamp across the front. Beside these items were short lines that looked like coded text. The corridor smelled stale, like old paper and dust. The air felt thick in my throat, and my breathing was shallow. I recognized some of the addresses on the envelopes as belonging to neighbors in our building. That realization made my skin crawl. I wondered who put these papers here and what they had in mind. My pulse pounded in my ears. I tried to swallow, but my mouth felt dry. I stepped back and bumped into a table behind me. On top of it, I saw a small notebook filled with more notes. Some lines were about daily schedules, like apartment 202 leaves at 6:30 a.m. Others were about personal details. Woman at 3:05 likes classical music on Sundays. It was as though someone had been collecting small facts about all of us, facts that didn't belong in anyone else's hands. I stayed in that corridor for maybe 2 minutes, but it felt longer. I felt trapped, as if someone might step in and find me. My chest felt tight. I imagined footsteps right outside the corridor, about to corner me. I took a quick step backward, then turned toward the door. I heard my own shaky breath. I forced myself to walk out calmly, though I wanted to run. Once I made it into the hallway, I closed the door and hurried upstairs. My heart was beating fast, and my hands were trembling. I didn't know what I had just discovered, but I had the strong impression it belonged to Carlos. It was like he had some private archive of our building's residents, but I didn't understand why. No one had said anything about stolen mail or missing letters, only that he was acting strange and had some sort of breakdown. I went back to my apartment, locked the door, and sat on my couch, trying to make sense of it all. My mind kept going over the details, the scraps of paper, the coded notes, the pinned envelopes. None of it made sense. It seemed like he had been collecting personal information, but I didn't see any direct threats. There was no note saying he intended to do anything violent. Still, I felt uneasy, like someone had been watching all of us in ways we never suspected. My legs felt weak. My forehead was damp with sweat. I couldn't shake the feeling that, at any moment, someone might knock on my door and demand to know what I'd seen. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that corridor with its flickering light and those papers on the wall. The next day, I tried to share some of my concerns with Lucia and Marcos. I hinted that Carlos might have been looking at people's private details, but I didn't tell them the entire story. They brushed it off, saying, "That's creepy, but maybe you misunderstood." I noticed that neither of them seemed eager to dig deeper. I realized I was alone in my curiosity. I kept quiet after that. Days passed, and the tension around the building remained. People spoke of Carlos in hushed tones. No official explanation ever surfaced. The new postman, a quiet man named Jorge, showed up with our mail and avoided all personal conversation. He only said, "Good morning," delivered envelopes, and left. I found myself staring at the mailboxes near our lobby with a new sense of caution. Every envelope felt strange in my hands. When I picked up letters addressed to me, I thought about whether Carlos had inspected them or memorized my personal information. My stomach would tense up whenever I heard footsteps in the hallway. I didn't think anyone was out to harm me, but the sense of being observed lingered in my mind. Even though no one experienced a break-in or reported an actual threat, I noticed small changes. More neighbors locked their doors. Fewer people lingered in the courtyard, and conversations about personal matters became rarer. I felt I had crossed a line by discovering that hidden corridor, and I worried about what else might be down there. But I never went back. I was too unsettled to face it again. Eventually, the days returned to a kind of normal routine. People laughed again on the steps. Children played in the courtyard. We all went to work or school without expecting any new twists. Still, a part of me stayed on edge. I felt a faint chill when I passed by the basement door. Sometimes at night, I wondered if Carlos had come back, hidden in the shadows, listening to us from corners of the building. But he never reappeared. I got used to the new postman, Jorge, and his polite but distant manner. Over time, my anxiety mellowed, but the memory of what I saw never faded. I knew I had stepped into a space meant for secrets, and I didn't feel right about it. Whenever I handled my mail, I caught myself checking for signs of tampering or odd stamps. I felt suspicious of normal things, like a letter addressed to me in unfamiliar handwriting. My heart would race until I realized it was just a routine bill or a note from an old friend. No one spoke about Carlos again. If they did, it was only to say they hoped he recovered. But I always sensed that people were relieved he was gone, especially after hearing about his breakdown. They didn't want to imagine that he had been quietly collecting small details about all of us. To this day, I don't know what he intended or if he had a plan. Maybe he was fascinated by everyday lives. Maybe it was a sign of deeper problems. I only know it changed how I felt in that building. I never looked at a passing stranger the same way again, and I never gave out casual personal details to anyone wearing a friendly smile. We continued our routine. Weeks became months, but I remembered those pinned notes, those returned letters, and the unsettling sense that someone had been quietly examining my day-to-day existence. Even after moving away years later, I still felt a wave of unease when I thought about it. That sense of invasion, even without an actual crime, was enough to keep me awake on certain nights. I wanted an explanation, but I never found it. The memory of Carlos's hollow eyes stayed with me. The corridor, filled with that strange collection of letters and notes, remained unmentioned by anyone. Our building turned the page, but not without a small scar. I carried that scar with me, and I learned something about the fragility of normal life. We can go for months or years assuming we know our neighbors, but one day someone might start paying too much attention, and we realize we never knew them at all.